Well, hello there to all the good people of Ohio and beyond. This is Aaron Knapp, and you're tuned into Unplugged, broadcasting without permission. This is a place where the truth gets louder and we dig deeper, and where we always remember be lawful, not awful. If you want the full stories, the documents, the videos, and everything they don't want you to see, head on over to Aaron Knapp Unplugged.com, my new home for every investigation, every episode, and every update. And while you're here, be sure to like the video, follow the page, and hit subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the truth. We're building something real here. We're building something fearless, and we're doing it together. Welcome to Unplugged. Let's kick this thing off.
Plug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No.
All right, there, folks. Good evening, Lorain County, and all of Ohio. Tonight, we're going to touch on a little bit of topic here, the case they refused to touch, and how Hall and Silo inherited a slam dunk, and they chose silence, folks. I'm going to apologize in advance. It's going to be a little long. I had a couple drinks, kind of warm up for this one, because it's a big one, and I'm kind of saying some things that are a little scary. But nothing I've not done before, so we're going to start with Act 1, a story that was never sort of a side story, right? It's foundational context. We have to understand the basis behind all of this stuff. It's never been a side story, though it kind of appeared to be that way in the beginning. If you were watching from outside, officials were hoping they would stay compartmentalized, or at least to the members of the public who were never really given full record to examine. So, because from the very first documents, from the earliest public records, the initial contradictions that appeared between written public policy and real world action, it was already clear that what was unfolding was not isolated, not accidental, not even unique to one person or moment, right? It happened to a lot of people. And it may have felt like a footnote at first. It looked like a private dispute from the outside. And it may have been dismissed as personal conflict by the same institutions that benefit from the public when they never connect to the larger pattern, right? But when you trace back the record, honestly, and without fear, when you lay the timeline side by fucking side, and when you compare how similar these actors are and the way that they handled like things across multiple administrations, what emerges is not a collection of unrelated incidents, right? But something a little bit more uncomfortable. For me, for everyone, the reason why I didn't want to do this podcast, and for those in power. It's a repeating operational structure that has functioned inside Lorain County government for nearly 2 decades across police leadership, political, prosecutorial office, court administrations and administrators, political authority, because what you're hearing tonight is not one controversy, right? It's not one investigation. It's not one police chief, one sheriff, one prosecutor, or even one courtroom, folks. It's a structural pattern of behavior that persists regardless of who holds the title. Any given moment. The only variable that changes is the name of the person standing at the wrong end of the institutional protection. Before McKeon, there was Joseph Montalon. Before Montalon, there was Nancy Smith. Before Nancy Smith, there was cases that people will never see on the evening news, right? The cases that are quietly dissolved into sealed records. Silent dismissals, ruined lives with public accounting, none whatsoever held. Before any of that, long before any of these names are ever reaching the public awareness, there's already an institutional immunity problem that really kind of hardened and quietly hardened into policy throughout repetition rather than legislation. And it didn't begin with, and I didn't begin this work with JD, right? Ever. Tomlinson, he came later. I didn't begin this with national headlines. That came later too. Kind of what I began with was documents, public records requests, internal communications, transcripts, contradictory affidavits, I don't know, written statements that were exposed gaps no one wanted to reconcile. Because every time there's a rational explanation for what was demanded. The response pattern was the same every time: delay, deflection, redaction, or silence. That's it. And what became immediately clear, even from the earliest materials that I got, was that there's one single truth that reoccurs in Lorain. And that's the system in Lorain County does not handle internal critics the way it handles, say, you or the ordinary citizen. It doesn't rebut them with evidence. It does not disprove them with transparency. It doesn't even discipline itself when violations surface to the writing. What's it do? The system reverses the polarity of the inquiry. Well, it doesn't investigate the conduct, right? Because it can't do that, because that would be investigating us. So what's it do? It investigates the person who exposed the conduct. I.e., instead of the McCann investigation, Carrion opens the Knapp investigation. For the record, Tony, my name is spelled Aaron. For the record, Carrion Knapp, Knapp. In your case, should have been spelled MC, big capital C, ANN, McCann. Anyway, and once that flips the switch, right? Once someone is formally or informally designated as like the problem me, that machinery activates almost automatically without any advisory votes, no public hearings, no press releases, right? They're not going to announce the shift, but always it's going to be the same effects. Police reports begin to grow new layers of interpretation rather than factual correction. Prosecutors began to reframe statutes in creative ways, right? That kind of favor the institution and the installation of that institution rather than accountability. And then IA, Kyle Galinas, like he processes on a slow to a crawl and then disappears entirely. Kyle Galinas is like the saddest product of this whole thing. I feel bad for him. This is a man who is proudly, openly homosexual. And I have no problem with that. I don't give a shit if you guys like that or not. I do. I'm glad he is who he is. Let him be who he is. Shut the fuck up. And I may make jokes about, oh, super dick, whatever. It's not meant to be gay. Like, people who grew up in my time frame understood that. And my uncle is homosexual, and I actually care for homosexual people a lot. Because they're people, right? People. And so he got ruined by McCann. McCann was the first one. Bradley comes into office. McCann's out here calling Galinas fairy shoes. And I mean, God, guys, seriously, just think about this for 1 second. If I'm sitting over here and I have Jack Hall's face and I'm like, listen, guys, hey there, guys. Guess what? If I was going to think of one thing to call anybody gay whose name is Galinas, what would I say? Would it be, I don't know, gay boy or gay face or gay shoes? Or would it be Gaylinas? Gaylinas, folks. Come on. Gaylinas. That's what he said. The weakest ass shit I've ever heard. So insulting, so rude, so mean. Why would you say that? Because you're an asshole. And you were in the Coast Guard. But, hey, fine, whatever. You're going to do what you're going to do, right? That was what McCann did. He belittled the people that went up against him. And then he co-opted them. He made them feel like they were part of the system. He put Kyle, God bless him, in an IA. I give Kyle a lot of shit. But I'll say this. He's in an impossible position. He was when he was the union rep. He is when he's doing what he's doing. Anybody that's up against James McCann is almost in an impossible position. Well, why did you do what you did? Well, because I was in an impossible position. Either give up my ethical beliefs and conform to the society at large, become the asshole and part of the system that James McCann wanted me to be, or stand up against all that is holy and unholy and say, No. For fuck's sake, no. This is what they taught me in school. I graduated in 22. People forget that. They teach us ideals now, not just education. So when public records began to evaporate behind this newly discovered exemptions, judicial referrals stopped being acted upon without explanation. So what you're going to listen to tonight is not like a personality conflict. It's not a political disagreement, although it kind of is. It's not an internet dispute because none of it is. I just use the internet for its purpose as a tool. Not even a social media feed. What you're listening to tonight is operational logic, right, of institutional survival. That's it. The unspoken rule that's set, and it governs how power protects itself, how transparency becomes a threat. Now that logic just really didn't begin with Chief McCann. It kind of began with me. And it didn't end with me or McCann. Either of us, unless it's forcibly interrupted by a truly independent authority, right? That's the foundation. That's the context. That's the ground that we're all standing on as we move forward, folks. It's scary. It scares me. I get it. Let's see. What do we have here? Is it Garen? We're going to pause here for station effect really quick. Nope, that's my friend. So right now we're getting ready to get into Act 2. All right. So before I go into Act 2, I want to explain. This is the Montalban precedent, is what it's called. The Montalban precedent. I want you to get this, like I didn't initially. Amber messaged me and said, Aaron, like this guy, blah, 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 blah. My tapes, Sal Rivera, blah, 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 blah. Right. All I heard was Montalban tapes. Back in July of 24, Jack Hall sent me 3 documents. They were meant to really kind of attack then candidate Resendez, who was winning. And it was all about Montalban and Resendez, Captain Resendez, then during the Lorraine Police Sheriff's Party. Now, my original reason for supporting Hall over Resendez was for the very reason you see in here. Resendez was kind of a piece of shit. It's not that it was his fault. All right. And I'm not saying as a human he was a piece of crap. I'm saying as a captain in Sheriff's Department who had been taught by the Times, who had been taught by law enforcement of the Times, who had the mentality, the thought process, the drive of local, normal law enforcement. He did what he was taught. Plain and simple. So now we get to Act 2, which is the Montalban precedent, which is recently, while going through emails, trying to find everything they've all said to me throughout all of time, because I saved it all to put into one big document to show the public how fucked these people are, how fucked Tony, Jack, everyone is. Jack Hall, Jack Bradley, like all these people. All of these people have been doing the same thing to you forever. I mean, ask yourself this. Who was the defense attorney on Amber's case? Jack fucking Bradley. Okay? Now, again, I'm viewing all this bullshit from the outside. I'm looking at how they basically fucked a woman and a man. Black and white spots. Get the fuck out of here, you fucking idiots. You guys buy into that bullshit that you read? Really? And then you look at people like Rosenbaum. Dude, like, what happened to you? I'm just going to say, and I don't care who thinks ill of me for this. What happened to Mr. Rosenbaum was a product of what he's done in his life. When you're a bad human being, when you act like a bad human being, in my opinion, as a prosecutor, and he was a public official at the time, so I'm speaking on Rosenbaum, the prosecutor, not Rosenbaum, the human, so no legal bounds there, but this guy, Mr. Ironsides himself, this guy got shot in the back by his own son. It's online. Go look it up. Go listen to it. You can hear Rosenbaum's own son shoot him, and then he goes, "You shot me, you son of a bitch." Yeah, I did. Fuck, I had to live with you for fucking all these years. Sorry, my bad. So now Rosenbaum becomes Ironsides. And for those of you who don't know, go back and look up Ironsides, 1970s TV show. You'll figure it out. This guy is doing what he wants to do. All these people are doing what they want to do. They think that they have the better control over you, the human beings of this world. So now we're going to take a quick ad break for our sponsors, and then we'll get back to the Montalon precedents, anonymous speech, DOJ interest, armed retaliation, and my long form narrative. And we'll get back into the early 2000s when long before this body cameras were standard, long before viral videos and accountability existed, long before public records and activism became a structured movement. There was a series of anonymous letters that began circulating in Lorain County with an effect that would permanently alter the internal political memory of this whole region. Those letters were sent to newspapers. You guys don't remember them. Most of you guys who are online tonight don't remember this because it was back in the time before. It was back in your parents' time, maybe your grandparents. But those letters were sent to newspapers. They were sent to public officials. They were sent to federal agencies. And their contents were not vague, right? They were grievances. And they weren't vague grievances. They were not rumor-based. They were not rumor-based accusations. They were direct allegations of internal misconduct inside the Lorain Police Department. They named leadership, described protection of favored officers. And again, do we hear the repeating things? Describing protection of favored officers, outlining what the author claimed was systematic corruption, shielded by politically corrected authority. The author never was publicly verified, right? But the impact of the letters were immediate, undeniable, because they triggered two reactions that would later become permanent fixtures in all of Lorain's institutional behaviors. So first, number one, the letters triggered federal interest, FBI. So second, they triggered retaliation. Sound familiar? I know that feeling. So 2, 3, come on, guys. You can get more. Come on, more people can add this. Send it to your friends. Get us all involved. We're going to get deeper as we go. There's going to be more information. I know you don't feel it, but we're getting there. There's like 11 acts to this. So y'all better set in, get your popcorn ready. Tell your friends, tell your family. We're going to drop some truths, some secrets, and some bullshit tonight. It ain't about me. A little bit about me, but mostly about other people. So first, the letters triggered federal interest. They triggered retaliation. And this Montalon guy, a former Lorain police officer, had become the primary suspect in the authorship of these letters. Now, Montalon's important because his name kept coming up in my conversations with Amber. Amber kept saying Montalon, 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 and I think he's the one that released her tape. So I heard this name, and then I went back in my records in July of 2024. Jack had sent me these emails about Montalon, but it was about Resendez, not Montalon. But now, later, looking at it this way, it's about Montalon. It's about Resendez. It's about Amber. It's about her mom. So Montalon, a former Lorain police officer, he's become the primary suspect in the authorship of these letters. And from that moment forward, the story ceased to be about anything about anonymous speech, which it was, and became something far more dangerous, right? A collusion between whistleblowing and armed state power. By August of 28th of 2008, officers from multiple agencies, right, not just one, descended on Montalon's home in Wycliffe. Now, this was not some quiet administrative inquiry, folks. This was not a voluntary interview request, right? This was a multi-agency, armed operation involving LPD, Wycliffe Police, I don't know if I'm saying that, Wycliffe, the Lorain County Sheriff's Office, and a federal agent. All of them involved, right? All of them. The public justification offered afterward was framed as a raid as a response to alleged criminal threats. But the confrontation that unfolded kind of during that search, and when you read the reports, told kind of a little bit more of a revealing story and a motive. And back then they didn't care because that shit didn't get out, right? It does now. During the execution of the warrant, a Lorain County Sheriff's Captain. Now I want you guys to hear this name well. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip because I'm gonna sip this before I say this name. Richard Resendez. Richard Resendez, who had been personally named in those letters. He confronts Montalon directly, and he demanded Why did you attack me in those letters? A question that alone exposes the retaliatory intent rather than the dispassionate law enforcement duty, right? And again, this isn't my report. This is before I even moved here. This is law enforcement stuff. I've got this straight from something Jack sent me. And again, didn't read till recently. I'm kind of sad I didn't. I apologize to you, Mr. Hall, for not reading this earlier, because this would have really kind of told me a lot about all of you people. But there was this, a question alone. It exposes that retaliatory nature that Rich had. And I'm not sad that I went against him. I'm not saying he was with JD. Now I'm just saying Rich was a dick. Like the captain, Mr. Resendez, followed that with something even a little bit more chilling, right? He said, Rich Resendez, in the report that I was sent by Jack Hall as a candidate. It's public record. It is public record. I have it. I'll share it later. You're going to have a nice life once we're through with you. So Rich Resendez, in a report that's documented, that was sent to me by Jack Hall. I mean, again, I'm not saying Jack was wrong in most of what he sent me. Most of what Jack sent me was right. Rich was a piece of shit. Period. To this day, still don't dislike Jack Hall. Come on, guys. I mean, look. I don't dislike him. I think he's been misled by the commissioners and the people. Maybe not even misled, just... Yeah, I get it. I'm fucked. I want to believe that he's naively just rolled into this like a douchebag he didn't know. And I'm going to live with that thought until I know otherwise. Right now, I have no other facts to say that. But if I find out otherwise, I will report it. I will honestly admit I was dead fucking wrong. Right now, I was just fucking wrong. Not dead fucking wrong. Wrong. I supported the wrong candidate. No, I didn't. Because either way, there was no good candidate. I still think Jack's better than Rich. And you'll know why when I read this to you. So he says to this candidate, and I don't think Jack would ever say this, you're going to have a nice life once we're through with you. That's some fucked up shit. I don't care what you say. That language does not belong anywhere inside a constitutional search process because it reveals punishment before adjudication, vengeance before evidence. That's not how an unbiased officer conducts a lawful investigation. That is how retaliation speaks when it believes accountability is closing in, right? That's what Rich did. Rich Resendez documented, said that. Now, Montalban later filed federal civil rights lawsuit alleging that search warrant and affidavit contained material false statements, that Ohio's menacing statutes were intentionally misused as pretext rather than applied in good faith. And he's kind of right. Like, that the true purpose of that operation was the suppression of criticism, the letters, rather than protection of public safety. That a sheriff's captain, Rich Resendez, personally targeted by the letters, had no lawful or ethical justification to participate in any investigatory role tied to the author of these letters. Kind of like James McCann with me, right? And the federal record confirms something that local officials never wanted publicly examined, and you guys never kind of really did, right? You guys ignored a lot of shit. I'm going to say that out loud. Like Lorain County law enforcement, from Sal Rivera to McCann to whoever the fuck you want to name. Stameti, I don't give a shit which piece of shit law captain you name. All these law dogs have been assholes. They've been about themselves. And I was a back the blue guy in California. I loved cops. But not these kind of cops. Not these East Coast cops. Not what they're doing. Because when a sheriff's captain personally targets or is targeted by the letters, has no lawful or ethical justification to participate in any of those investigatory roles tied to the author of the letters. If he was targeted, he can't be involved. So Rich should have never been involved. Ever, 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 ever. That's illegal. I don't give a fuck what you say. If you don't like me, fuck you. The federal record confirms something that the local officials never wanted publicly examined, right? Despite multiple public statements by Lorain officials suggesting that the federal alignment with the FBI later clarified that anonymous complaint letters by themselves do not constitute criminal activity under federal law. Hear that. The FBI later clarified that anonymous complaint letters by themselves do not constitute criminal activity under federal law, and that the Bureau's only legitimate interest would have been in assessing the corruption allegations themselves, not in prosecuting alleged speech-based threats of Montalban, the letters. Translation, that means the criminal justification that was constructed by the locals was not supported by the FBI. Period. They publicly implied that the FBI was assisting them. Well, that's not a technical defect, right? That's jurisdictional malfunctioning or manufacturing, sorry. Like, it becomes more of a and more significant when you examine the outcome, right? So despite the raid, despite the seizure of property, despite the public spectacle, right? The public spectacle that Lorain County loves so fucking much, despite the federal attention, despite no criminal charges were ever successfully sustained against Montalban, the detective, for the anonymous letters themselves, right? What was imposed instead was something far quieter. They actually said, I think they said Dennis Flores was also responsible for the letters. Honestly, guys, you know what? I know I wasn't here and I was probably 12 at the time. I wrote the letters. I'm sorry. I digress. But I mean, come on, that's funny. Like, after years of legal isolation, public identification, like, seems more like a pariah. Financial pressure that gradually erased stability. That's the Montalban precedent. That's what Jack sent me in July or June of last year that I had no clue he sent me. I looked at this Montalban bullshit and I didn't think anything of it. But then Amber keeps saying Montalban. And I listened to her and I go, Montalban. That's why I know that name. It's the Montalban precedent, right? He's key to everything. Anonymous criticism becomes criminal suspicion. Period. Self-mayor, me and others, clandestine culinary, Sensei Cobra. How much has Sensei Cobra been wrong? Never. This motherfucker is right about everything, including the Midway Mall. You guys can kiss my ass. That guy, dude, he knows everything. And I write his stories because if these other newspapers were smart, they would too. Just know, guys, the reason why you tune in here is because I'm just stupid enough, just moronic enough to tell you the fucking truth, right? I mean, I'm going to give you a little. This isn't in my script because I have a script, obviously. I read out the script. Every night when I do this now, because I do it religiously with intent. I'm not going to just come on here and bullshit you guys. I have something I'm writing. I have facts. I back it up. I look at it. But this is the side effect here. You guys got to look at this from a standpoint of at what point does it become, like a point where you're like, okay, listen, I get it. Maybe there's some bullshit going on around here, but God, can Aaron be wrong about everything? I mean, when Aaron says things like, and then it comes true, what happened?
A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit.
I mean, that's it. That's it, folks. Because that's the Montalban area, bro.
Pretty soon when he's gonna
Like, literally, like, anonymous criticism becomes criminal suspicion. Criminal suspicion becomes armed enforcement by the cops. Armed enforcement actually eventually becomes silencing. You've seen that online. I've shared these. I know I share a lot of like First Amendment audit push. I'm like, oh God, I hate to see this. That's where we're at next, folks. You can believe or not, but I promise you we're going to be there. Armed enforcement becomes silencing. That model does not expire. It just waits for the next fucking target. That's it. So here we are at Act 3, folks. Act 3. Oh God, it's been a long night. Anyway, we're going to take a lot of clips out of this. I'm going to do a quick play of our ad sponsors, take my hoodie off and get a little cooler, and then we'll be right back. I promise I'm right here while we're doing this ad sponsor shit. I will really, really be right back. I swear to God. Hey there, folks. If you really want to know what's happening in your hometown, the place to go is Lorain Daily and Vermilion Daily. From city council and school boards to local businesses, community events, and neighborhood stories, these outlets cover what the big media ignores. This is hyper-local news for real people in real communities. Visit Lorraine Daily and VermilionDaily.com today. Read it, share it, support local journalism because your community deserves coverage that actually lives here. Hey there, folks. DNC Radio is your home for real conversations, real community voices, and independent radio that doesn't answer to the corporate filters or political scripts. From music to live talk, community issues to uncensored discussion, DNC Radio is powered by the people, not the algorithms. If you're tired of sanitized media and ready for something real, tune into DNC Radio. You can follow and listen right now at facebook.com/DNC Radio OH. That's facebook.com/DNC Radio OH. If you own a business and you want to reach customers right here in Lorain County and Vermilion, this is your opportunity, folks. Advertising space is now available in Lorraine Daily, Vermilion Daily, and DNC Radio. That means your business can reach local readers, local listeners, and a highly engaged community audience. And here's a bonus. For a small add-on fee, your business will also be advertised once per episode on my podcast, Unplugged with Aaron Knapp, as long as your ad remains active on one of those two platforms. This is web exposure plus podcast exposure in one package. If you're interested in advertising, contact me now to reserve your spot through Facebook, email, or reach out directly. Ad space is limited and local visibility matters, folks.
Unplugged with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask.
All right, folks, thanks for sitting through that quick sponsorship ad there. We got Nancy Smith in the conviction pipeline coming up. Wrongful prosecution is power preservation, right? We're going to go back to long form of this again, as I always do. And while Joseph Montalon was being targeted for what amounted to anonymous political speech, and it was, an internal criticism by his own fellow officers, another case was already moving through Lorain County justice system. And that's going to reveal in far more devastating fashion how deeply embedded the culture of certainty and narrative control and institutional self-proclamation and protection have become and already become long before Montalon's name was ever entered into the public consciousness. And that was Nancy Smith. All right. I know I've only recently got into the Nancy Smith case, as a lot of you have, even though we should know it. A lot of us don't know it because we weren't back. A lot of you were just kids back then, or babies, and some of you weren't even here. But in the early 90s, Nancy Smith and Joseph Allen were accused of horrific acts, right? Horrific acts involving children connected to Lorain County Head Start programs. These were allegations that detonated into immediate community panic. It triggered an investigative response driven not by any sort of verified forensic discovery, right? But by institutional urgency, political fear, emotional momentum, and some sort of a prosecutorial environment where doubt was treated as disloyalty rather than due process. This was going on across the country, folks, not just here. I saw it in California. We all saw it. But the core of what the case rested about was almost entirely on child testimony obtained through highly suggestive interview techniques. Highly suggestive. Even, look, I read them. And the lady that did the psychological review and by DSM-5 would say that these were the techniques they used in these interviews were not just like modern psychology, like now universally condemns as prone to contamination, coercion, and memory implantation and narrative reinforcement rather than accurate recollection. Yet at the time, these methods were presented to the jury as scientifically reliable beyond question. That's like so wrong it's not even funny. Like, you can't say that to people. If I said to you, hey, look, listen, guys, I want to let you know that I can't even lie because I'm a bad liar. I can't say, hey guys, guess what happened? Because it was a lie. It was fucking lies. There was no physical evidence tying Nancy Smith to the alleged crimes, right? Ever. Still isn't. Not one today. You find me one. Find me one. Not one. No DNA. And no medical consensus between any of the medical or mental health providers. No verified crime scene. They couldn't even find the fucking house, folks. The fuck? Y'all were crazy back then. Oh, wait. That wasn't. my parents. So there was no independent corroboration, no that was capable of surviving any sort of adversarial scrutiny. And yet the prosecution advanced with this absolute institutional certainty that, hey, rather than evidentiary balance, right, in Lorain County, we don't need that bullshit. Rather than, both Nancy Smith and Joseph Allen were convicted and sentenced to prison terms that ultimately consumed 14 years of their lives, 14 years of incarceration. Imagine that, folks. 14 years. My daughter's 14. 14 years of lost time with their families. 14 years of medical deterioration. 14 years of reputational annihilation. And then, after almost a decade and a half, the convictions collapsed, right? Finally, the fucking records emerged showing the interviews were fundamentally flawed. Expert analysis showed, because we learned, as we all do, and then exposed the identification methods that were deeply compromised back then. You know what the fuck you were doing. And the prosecutions revealed hallmarks of coercion rather than reliability. I mean, look, most of what I hear from Amber when she talks about it revolves around these tapes that we haven't seen yet, but eventually we will. These tapes talk about the way they move the lineups. I mean, look, if I played this story out for you as it happened on video, you wouldn't believe it. That's all I can say. Once the tapes are released, you'll realize it. I can't speak on them because I haven't seen them. But from what I've been told, they're amazing. I won't speak on what I've never seen. I've never seen them. But the prosecutions, they all revealed the same thing. Hallmarks of coercion rather than reliability. Everyone said it. Their convictions were thrown out. 14 years. Fucking gone. Gone. 14 years that no court could ever return to Amber, to Amber's mom, to anybody, right? You guys can all hate me for wanting to help Amber because you guys all wanted to help her. I want you to help her. All of you. Every last one of you. Tucker, Katie, Tia, even though you guys are on shaky grounds because you guys stopped lying, bitch. Anybody that wants to help Amber, help her. Help her. Does Amber not deserve help? Does Amber not deserve to have the childhood that she was stolen from her? That childhood was stolen from her? Does Amber's mom not deserve to go back to that woman she was? I look at this case for you guys as I look at it for Kern County when I lived there in our case like this. It's your stain, folks. It's a stain on your society. The best thing you can do is free this woman. Help this woman. And the way you can do that the most, think about it. If I'm a parent, how can I do that the most? I create an environment where that person's child can live carefree. Create an environment where Amber can roller skate. That's all I ask. I don't care what any of you people think about me. I don't care what any of you stupid fucks out there say about me. About Madhouse, about any of this bullshit, right? Here's what I got from Madhouse and all that bullshit. And you. Don't fight you. Don't care about you. I care about black, white, wrong, right. That's it. Amber was right. Her mom was right. They were wrong. Not D or R. Not Silo or Hall or JD. What really matters is that none of those people were involved in this shit. But that 14 years are gone. Fucking gone. Gone. Go look at the roller skate pictures. Go look at any picture of Amber. Any picture, well, like 6 pictures of her mom. Why? Because for fucking 14 years, you had her locked up with no pictures. Think about that. All of you, think about that. What would you do if your mom was in jail? I don't give a fuck. I would have broke her out. 14 years, no court could ever return to you. Ever. If I'm going to let her out, right? But what followed that kind of exposed the deepest layer of this institutional pathology instead of actually accepting the collapse of those convictions, right? As proof of something inside this investigative and prosecutorial pipeline had failed catastrophically, right? The state attempted to restart the machine and put them right back in that same nightmare. A second fucking time. Now, I get it. You guys maybe lived this. I didn't. I didn't know it. I didn't see it. Not because new physical evidence has emerged, right? Not because the forensic truth had changed, but because institutional certainty had actually been wounded. People with reputations had their butts hurt. Butt hurt. It wasn't a failure of memory or a refusal of like institutional conscience, folks. This is like, here is where the connection to Montalon, right, becomes unavoidable. Amber mentioned Montalon to me, right? Here's where I got it. I said it earlier. People want to hear it. I apologize. I have had a couple of drinks, so but you get normal Aaron right now. Like you get calm Aaron. Like I'm thinking, not quite intoxicated, just on that edge, and I'm not going to get it any beyond this. It's it all Red Bull from here on out. But that kind of allows me to connect with these things because I put away my anxiety that every one of you feels. I feel. We all feel it. We drink, we smoke, we do what we do. We take meds. We become codependent to help with these problems that we all have. So if you act like you're better than me, then you're not. And I'm not better than you. I'm not. There's no chance I'm better than any one of you watching right now. I am a piece of shit. You are a piece of shit. We're all pieces of shit floating in that same toilet bowl. As long as we float together. In the end, as long as we try to be better pieces of shit than we were yesterday. Maybe tomorrow I got corn. I don't know. I'm saying be better today than you were yesterday. That's all I care about. I don't hate any of you. I'm going to say it right now. Fuck off. But Tia, I don't hate you. I don't know you, sweetie. I've never been angry at you or mad at you, or I've never really cared about you. Now, once you integrated yourself in my life, yeah, maybe I got a little scared because you're a little crazy. But I can respect that. And I can respect that you do what you do out of a thought and a drive. And what you need is a hug. And maybe a father's love. Aiden, we're square. You know why I was mad? Me and you had a long 3-hour conversation. I thought we knew each other. I thought I knew you. I get you. Other people may hate you, but you're an intelligent man who's educated himself over the years, who has learned from his pains, from his suffering, from his crimes, and you become a better human. I pointed it out when I commented, you're the only one qualified to talk to the commissioners on defense attorneys. I recognize your unique position in our system, as most social workers do. I get it. So I support you. John Moreau, you're an asshole. I get it. But so am I, dude. And I love everything you sell. Everything John Moreau sells, I love. I love every one of his stories. I love everything he writes about Sheffield Lake. I love everything he's ever said, except for that dumb bullshit when he got sucked into some dumbass shit with Tia and wrote some dumbass shit, said some dumbass shit in the police report that he thought would never get out because it never should have. But Janice Gura gave it to me unredacted, so I know. Sorry, I know. I can't unknow what I know about what you said. I should have never known it. I apologize, I do. That being said, I do know it. So how about this, John Moreau? I respect you. I respect your story. I respect your win. You and Aiden. Good job. Both of you. Like, I lost to Angel fucking Arroyo. I'm so sad. Anyway, I lost. You guys won. Good job. And I appreciate what you... And I know some people don't like you, but you know I'm black and white, right? Black and white. And you guys are in the black, so to speak, the print. The white's the bad, the black's the good. You're in the black. Not right, at least. So I too can be like, I'm not whoever you think I am. I don't give a shit about any one individual or one. My ideals are my ideals. That's it. Right, wrong, black, white. It's not a failure of memory. It's a refusal of institutional conscience, folks. But here's where the connection to Montalon becomes unavoidable. It was Montalon who later helped surface the additional materials casting further doubt on the Head Start prosecutions with Nancy Smith. Right? Amber brought it up. Amber said it to me, and she goes, Montalon, right? I didn't think nothing of it. And then Amber says, you should go to church with me. So I went to this Baptist church, and she wasn't there, but I was there. And God spoke to me. And I looked back in my Bible here, and I saw all these yellow lines. And I had to ask the preacher and other people questions because I'm not highly religious, but, these were things I highlighted as a kid. 17-year-old kid in the field, in the military, in the army, in the Gulf War, wherever. I highlighted these things, and they surface now. Why? Was it Amber that brought me to church to make me see that? To make me see what I need to see about her case, her mom's case? About life, about love, about happiness? About people who make a difference. And Amber, maybe Montalon's not a great guy. Maybe Montalon actually I don't know. I feel like she said Montalon. Somebody released one of her tapes about Cell. But Cell was a topic of Montalon as well as other people for a long time. Well, I respect Amber's right to keep the tapes. I respect Montalon trying to uncover long-term institutional behaviors that are questionable at best. And we see that throughout the history of Lorraine. I've been writing about this for a couple of years now, right, guys? A lot of you hating me from the beginning. You hate me now. A lot of you don't. And I can tell by the amount of people asking me to tell their stories in my inbox. For the record, folks, if you're watching right now and you're in my inbox, I will get to you. I'm going to write your stories. That's my new goal. We'll write all your stories. We'll put them out there. Truth be told. That's it. But this is not a failure of memory. It's not a refusal of institutional consciousness, right? It's where connections between Montalon actually become unfucking avoidable. Montalon who later helped surface additional materials casting further down on the Head Start prosecution with Nancy Smith. It was Montalon who brought those concerns back to media circulation, just like yours truly right now. I'm the modern day Montalon. How long before they raid my house? So it was Montalon who brought those concerns back to media circulation. It was Montalon, who forced the wrongful conviction narrative back into public visibility when officials hoped history had quietly buried it. Now, Amber may not like that, but Montalon did her a huge favor if he was the one that released it. Because that means the same figure that was rated for anonymous criticism, right, of a police department, a sheriff's department, and of Rich Resendez, suddenly is also instrumental in re-illuminating one of Lorraine County's most devastating wrongful conviction scandals in the history of the entire fucking county. Really? Oh, yeah. Doesn't feel like coincidence. Kind of feels like motive. And that's why that retaliation report was so severe. Because those two cases together, at their core, represent the same institutional fear. Fear of losing narrative control, fear of losing prosecutorial certainty and authority, fear of exposing an exposure that cannot be neutralized through silence. And fear doesn't vanish with elections, right? It doesn't. We see it. It evolves, it adapts, it relocates. And it'll happen again. And it'll appear again. Because they know before the election, right? Always what's going to happen. And now we're at Act 4. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. First, we're going to put our glasses on so we can see what we're doing. Oh, look at that. Here at Unplugged with Aaron Knapp, we like to thank our sponsors. We have a few unofficial sponsors tonight, and they are definitely not paid sponsorships. I want to throw out there a big thank you to Joseph Jones and Eric Jones of the Lorraine Daily and the Vermilion Daily. They have a local news page. You should check them out. They do plenty of great work. broadcasting all the news that is the news that you want to have in Lorain and Lorain County. So check them out. Also, please, if you need any legal services, feel free to reach out to Robert Gargas. You can find him listed online. He's a fine attorney and comes highly recommended by yours truly. And last but not least, I want to mention DNC Radio. Please make sure you check out one of the up-and-coming internet hip-hop stations and all of their shows. They put on a lot of shows. You have the Never Outdone show. You also have the Eric Bowen show, Speak Up, Speak Out. So please make sure you guys check them out as well if you're looking for your latest and up-to-date hip-hop artistry. Thank you for tuning in. If you own a business and you want to reach customers right here in Lorain County and Vermilion, this is your opportunity, folks. Advertising space is now available in Lorain Daily, Vermilion Daily, and DNC Radio. That means your business can reach local readers, local listeners, and a highly engaged community audience. And here's a bonus. For a small add-on fee, your business will also be advertised once per episode on my podcast, Unplugged with Aaron Knapp, as long as your ad remains active on one of those two platforms. This is web exposure plus podcast exposure in one package. If you're interested in advertising, contact me now to reserve your spot through Facebook, email, or reach out directly. Ad space is limited and local visibility matters. All right, folks, we're back to Act 4. What they knew before the election and how we're going to expose it. So, by the time the campaign speeches began back in 24, the air was already filling with familiar and reassuring promises of reform, integrity, transparency, and accountability. The central figures in all of this story already possessed all the very same documentary record that you're hearing right now. They already had it. I sent it to them. Well, that means everything that followed cannot be honestly explained, right? By ignorance or delay or misunderstanding or even bureaucratic confusion. Only by the foreknowledge that followed by deliberate institutional inaction, folks. I'm going to say this part with heavy heart. This is why I had a couple of drinks tonight. Because I didn't want to say it. Because I'm about to say some things about somebody that I cared deeply about that I thought was going to be better than they were. And they're not. But that doesn't change how I feel about them, right? We love who we love. And someone I love and cared about has gone south. So by July 2024, Jack Hall, he's still only a candidate for sheriff, right? He's not sworn in, not yet seated behind the institutional authority of sheriff of the badge, right? He's not commanding the personnel, the budgets, task forces, or even the investigative apparatus of the department. But he's already in possession of this documentation showing that Chief Buchanan's conduct was, being actively managed, filtered, delayed, and shielded through the internal routing systems, public records expression, and law department review, which is the precise point at which a case stops being speculative and starts becoming real. Because once the paperwork confirms suppression, the issue no longer is rumor. It's process. So that distinction matters for one critical reason and one critical reason only. Because candidates are not insulated from knowledge. They are not insulated only from duty, so to speak, meaning they can see a problem clearly without being legally required to act upon it. Jack Hall, the candidate, was not required to do shit without yet being trapped inside that institutional dependencies that later will dictate what you can and cannot be touched, what you can and cannot do, right? And that quiet space between knowing and acting is that exact space between where intent begins to form. So during that period, communication existed between me and him and other people, and guidance was given, record strategies was discussed, procedural obstacles were acknowledged, and more importantly, expectations were shaped at the time when nothing yet prevented any sort of clarity. Like, what we were doing was fine because it was legal, which directly contradicts that later public framing that Hall somehow inherited this complicated, fully developed mess only after taking office, because documentary evidence really kind of shows he inherited a fully assembled evidentiary package from me. Active record, suppression routed through ops and law. He knew it. And a judicial referral trajectory that was already forming before the election ever occurred. At the same time, we got the prosecutor's office, right? Now, these jackasses, Tony Sillo. I mean, all right, before I go into Tony Sillo, I'm going to say this. Again, a couple drinks in. And as Tia would say, in my humble opinion, Tony Sillo is a jackass. I mean, this dude emailed me today saying, "Oh, James McCann's not the sheriff or the police chief anymore." I get that, dude. I'm sorry. I made a mistake, just like you did when you wrote Aaron. You can't spell my name right. Aaron. Copy and paste, jackass. But you're gonna talk shit to me? Man, fuck you. Tony Sillo dude, you can kiss my ass, prosecutor or not. You're a dumbass. The way you speak to me as if you don't work for me is obscene. The way Jack said the same thing to me. I have no responsibility to acknowledge when or what I'm investigating or how. Really? That's where we're at? You guys, my elected officials, who once, at least in Jack's case, called upon me as if I were an expert, as prosecution once did in the courts with the juvenile justice prosecutors and the juvenile justice courts like Sherry Glass, I don't know, Judge Janik. All of you guys said, let's refer to the expert. And I went, oh shit, you guys mean me. All right, got you. So Jack's asking me all these email questions, always like everybody's making me feel important. I get it. I got taken advantage. Okay. Can you give a guy like 5 seconds to feel special? I'm brand new at OSU 22, 3 years ago. I had the idealism of a 19-year-old. I believe I can change the world. I roll into Lorain County trying to change the world. When I moved here for my girl and bought a house here, people in Ohio were like, in Southern Ohio were like, "Oh, we're sorry for you. Why do you want to live there?" Well, I already lived there. I commuted from here. You guys can say I hated you, but I'm a creature of habit. And I told my daughter this a million times. Why don't we live in Avon? Because does Avon need a social worker? Well, no. Why do I have to suffer? Because I drug your ass along with me for the ride. Shut the fuck up. Be poor. Enjoy eating less. Enjoy wearing less. Enjoying feeling less. I want you guys to think about this. Okay, stop for 1 second. Don't think about, I hate Aaron, right? Think about this. Imagine this scenario. You're a man. You grew up in an alcoholic household. I did this podcast, so we're not going to delve into it, right? But I got this viewpoint of the world. I go in the military. I get out. I moved from California, most arguably liberal state of the union, to Idaho, the arguably most conservative state in the union, to Ohio, which is some sort of fucked up individual between. And I get here, and I'm now taking all my life experience to this point. I've been demolished by the woman I love. I have PTSD that doesn't allow me to feel shit. I have a child I fought for forever. I get here with this innate sense of fuck you. And your chief of police and everybody just fucks me back. Okay, cool. That's how we're here. That's how we ended up here. But hey, somehow we ended up here. So at the same time that the prosecutor's office, under this emerging authority of Tony Sillo now, who I've helped get elected, and Jack Hall, who I've helped to get elected, they're already shaping how this case would be handled long before the ink ever dried on the oath of office that they swore, like through early conflict assertion, judicial redirection, strategic record filtering, legal positioning, and quietly moving one complaint or my complaint out of the category of investigation into the category of institutional risk management, right? Months after public was ever told there was a quote, nothing to see here. But the subtle but devastating shift in this that defines everything that follows is once the case becomes a containment problem, so to speak, instead of an actual investigative problem, the central question ceases to be whether a violation occurred and becomes instead, so to speak, how exposure will be confined, minimized, delayed, redirected, or even neutralized before it spreads beyond the control of the institutions that now share vulnerability. They all do. Never last one. Anyone I emailed shares vulnerability. That's why I email everyone. Correll pointed that out when he was electioneering me at a polling place and attacking me illegally. But you guys let that shit happen too, because you don't give a fucking Idaho in Ohio, right? Fuck, Lorraine don't care. You can smoke in a police car against ORC. You can fucking attack a politician at a polling site. You can yell at a citizen in the middle of an open meeting when you're the safety service director, act like a fucking asshole. Fuck you, Ray. Fuck you, Ray. Fuck you, Ray. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. Because you're a little bitch, like you've always been since you sat on my porch and fucking lied to me. But that's okay. I got that for you. Like, I'm not trying to take that away from you. Like, you know what you did? You know what you lied to me about? I'm not gonna sit here. That's why you yelled at me that day. That was it. There was no other reason. Like, I get it. I'm okay with that. I was actually okay with you yelling at me on that day because not that it wasn't illegal or wrong or procedurally inadequate, but because it was the only truly human thing you've ever done. I mean, honestly, in that moment, your wife must have looked at your face and went, "Oh my God, that's what it looks like when he has real emotion." But okay, you do what you got to do, right? You do you. I'm not worried about what you do. I'm not worried about really any of that, right? But you do you. So, hold on 1 second. Just to make sure where we're at. I feel like we're at 5, but I'm at 4. So, I don't have that little thing up with comments. So speeches began, filling the air with familiar reassuring promises of reform, integrity, transparency, and accountability, right? What we really see is central figures in this whole story. They're already possessed with the same documentary record that you're already hearing about now, which means everything that followed and everything that follows cannot be honestly explained by ignorance. I wish it would, because I could go like, well, you're just ignorant, you're a jackass. Fuck. But no, delay, misunderstanding, bureaucratic confusion, only by this foreknowledge, followed by a deliberate institutional inaction. So in 2024, like, Jack Hall is still just a candidate. He ain't sworn in. He ain't seated with the institutional authority of the badge. He's not commanding personnel or, oh, yes, I did read all this, didn't I? I did. Hold on. I apologize. So we're going to move on to, at that moment, we're going to end 4, which is the one I was just rereading. At that moment, truth does not disappear, right? It gets regulated. Because before that, it's a subtle but devastating shift that defines everything that follows, because once a case becomes containment, that problem, instead of an investigative problem, becomes a centralized question. It ceases to be a violation of what occurred and becomes instead how exposure will be confined, minimized, delayed, redirected, or neutralized before it spreads beyond the control of the institution itself that now share vulnerability. That's money, folks. Money. Fucking money. That's it. Money. So there's a distinct, unmistakable tone that shift, a tonal shift that occurs when a man transitions or a person transitions from being a candidate, like I was seeking. Well, I wasn't seeking power, but from a candidate seeking power in Jack to an office holder required to protect the power that he just got. I didn't get it. Everybody else did, and that's cool. Everybody's happy about that. I kind of was too. Because fuck that. You guys who are in power are required to protect the public. And so to speak, by protecting the public, you protect yourselves. There's this automatic out I don't get as a social worker. I'm not attached to my clients like you are. You're voters. But before the election doors even feel open, messages feel welcome. Conversations flow with a sense of urgency and a shared interest, right? And a reform that's spoken aloud as not only possible but expected. Once the election is over and authority, so to speak, just ends or settles into place, the architecture of the system begins to reassert itself with this slow, methodical pressure. It's just what it was before, just not so fierce yet. So you forget again. And you will forget. Because before the election, Sheriff Hall, engaged. He acknowledged my filings. He responded to my communications. He spoke in the language of public accountability. He recognized the structural problems that were being placed directly in front of him, right? I gave him everything on McCann, everything I had, all of my evidence, and he was cool. He was like, yeah, that's wrong. What changed wasn't the evidence, right? Because what really happened was he engaged with all these things. He spoke the language of public accountability. But when he actually got in office, you know what happened? After the election, like those doors didn't just slam shut. I got one last open report from Jenna Skura about the John Burrow incident, and then everything else was redacted. Ask yourself that question. Why was the John Moreau, Tia Hilton report unredacted? Other people asked that too. They're right to ask it. And everything else was redacted. Because I went from friend to foe. That's it. But as Gordy turned into this familiar institutional language of delay and review, they all like, oh yeah, we're good. So what changed was not the evidence, right? Because the documents do not mutate when the votes are counted. The facts don't rearrange themselves when an oath is taken. And what changed really was the institutional cost of action, right? What's it going to cost me to move forward? Because once you're elected, the sheriff's office instantly became operationally dependent on the very department whose chief was now under scrutiny in the Lorraine police. Because arrests, investigations, evidence flow, field operations, task force, credibility, case construction. Well, the prosecutor's office, they remain structurally dependent on that same exact police department for charging authority and crime visibility as well. So once those dependencies for candidate Hall and candidate Silla became real, they lock into place the idea that McCann is no longer merely a subject of review as a civilian from the outside. He becomes a load-bearing pillar, right? He's the one holding it all up. And your job is to protect the public and the system and at all costs. So the systems by their nature do not indict their own foundation. That's fucking idiotic. So the turning point in the story was never about the truth changing. It was about the piece of the movement, so to speak, becoming too high for the institution to pay that price without destabilizing themselves. And once that price became visible, silence became the safest option available to everyone involved. What that really means is, do I believe Hall didn't believe what he told me? No. I believe Hall sold me the truth as he saw it. God bless him. I also believe once he got in office, he got fucked. He's given me one or two little bones outside of that when he called me before the election on, election night and stuff to say, I recognize you, and I get that. I hear you, Jack. I don't dislike you. I don't hate anybody. I believe you, like Billy the Kid in Young Guns 2 said, the governor, he didn't lie, he doesn't have the power. It's the politicians and the money. Jack, you didn't have the power, it's the money. If you want me to believe, when you had your lawyer, who isn't your lawyer, Nietzsche, show me your wife's credit card records, what the fuck? So if you didn't believe I was in any danger, why would you show me your wife's credit card records? But you show them to me and say, look, we paid for the trip. So who's to say Bukovic and his crew, the lunch bunch, didn't give you the money afterwards? I'm not saying they did, because that would be insane. I'm just saying that's a possibility. That's the possibility I was bringing up. That was the one I was trying to cut off. Instead of cutting it off and doing like I said, you exasperated it by acting like I was the problem. Because I didn't think you did that. I still don't. I hope you didn't. Fuck, I hope you didn't. God, I'll look like an asshole. Don't do that. But I don't think you did. I think you just didn't recognize the extent of the rot. So then we get into this rot picture of Tia Hilton, all these people, with this bar photo of Hall and fucking McCann together, right, at Ziggy's. There's like one moment in this entire time it doesn't really function as a speculation, so to speak, or interpretation or symbolism, or even it functions as visual declaration. It's a collapse, institutional protection, personal harm, public posture. And it falls into a single image that cannot be unseen once it happens. When St. Patrick's Day photographs showed surfaced of Hall and McCann together, right, in a public setting, shaking hands, the meaning was not abstract to me, and it was not merely a political theater, because people were like, oh, what was it? Something over conflict, like community over conflict. That's what she said. I get it. I really do. She's not wrong in that aspect. But when you look at those two together, McCann, Hall, St. Patrick's Day photograph, you see them in a public setting, and the meaning, it's not so abstract. She uses it the way she should. By the way, props to you. That was a good use of that picture. And a great quote. I'm going to stop for a second to say, that quote you made was over conflict. No, it was community over conflict. Brilliant. Fucking brilliant. I'm jealous. That's an amazing statement. I want to steal it. I want to quote it. I want to use it. And you were right. In that moment, if it were true, it would be great. But it wasn't. Oh, we're down to one viewer. Shit. We suck. Anyway, so together in a public social setting, the meaning was not abstract, at least to me. It was not merely political theater, because at the exact moment that my affidavit had already been prepared, my criminal complaints were formally pending, my public records request had been stalled inside the law department of Lorraine, and my filings were being filed through the same institutional framework that remained operationally dependent upon McCann. The newly elected Sheriff Hall stood publicly beside the very fucking guy whose conduct formed the backbone of my allegations. True or not, that image power, it did not appear neutral. It didn't look uncertain or restrained or aligned. Alignment does not require conspiracy to cause damage, because all that's required for authority to appear to choose a side is before due process is finished, is active process for speaking. And because once the public sees that choice, you at Hall and McCann, trust collapses automatically, right? Regardless of the explanations of why or what may follow later. That moment where law quietly yields to the optics. That once someone like Tia or anybody says, they take control of that narrative, right? And they say, community over conflict, right? I wasn't conflicting with him, but McCann. But okay. So that's that moment when the lie quietly yields to the optics. And it allows that once the optics take control of the narrative, that institutional behavior will almost always will follow the posture that is being displayed in that statement. So here we are, campaign access versus the post-election silence. Act 5. This is me, Jack. Not so much Silva because I supported Jack, not Silva. But we're at Act 5. I'm going to pause, take a quick drink of water, and we'll be right back with our next section, folks. Please stay tuned in for a brief moment as I give you an ad sponsorship. Folks, this was an unpaid for ad by both these individuals, paid for by Aaron Knapp. Unrequested, unsponsored, but well deserving. If you own a business and you want to reach customers right here in Lorain County and Vermilion, this is your opportunity, folks. Advertising space is now available in Lorain Daily, Vermilion Daily, and DNC Radio. That means your business can reach local readers, local listeners, and a highly engaged community audience. And here's a bonus. For a small add-on fee, your business will also be advertised once per episode on my podcast, Unplugged with Aaron Knapp, as long as your ad remains active on one of those two platforms. This is web exposure plus podcast exposure in one package. If you're interested in advertising, contact me now to reserve your spot through Facebook, email, or reach out directly. Ad space is limited and local visibility matters, folks. This was an unpaid for ad by both these individuals, paid for by Aaron Knapp. Hey there, guys. We're back. Act 5, campaign access versus post-election silence. We're going to give you the distinct and unmistakable tonal shift that occurs when a man like Jack Hall transitions from being a candidate, from seeking power, to an office holder, the sheriff, required to preserve and defend the power he just acquired. And I say this a lot, like, it's not really wrong because his job is to protect the people, even if he's the one fucking them. Because the election doors, they kind of feel open, right? The message feels welcome. We all think these conversations will carry a sense of urgency, shared interest, reform. And that's all spoken a lot as if it's only just possible, but expected, right? We're going to do better. We're going to be better. And access itself becomes part of that whole political promise that's being offered to the public during election cycles. Whereas after the election, that same access quietly transforms, right? Not through any overt hostility or confrontation, or even through structure, through process, through institutional gravity, but through the election itself. Hall engaged directly. He acknowledged violence. He responded to communications I gave him. He discussed regulatory issues with me. He spoke openly in language of public accountability and recognized the structural problems that were being placed in front of him without yet actually having to absorb those actual institutional consequences of acting on them, right? He's just candidate. After the election, doors, they didn't slam violently shut or dramatically, right? They just simply, they sealed slowly and methodically, one procedural layer at a time. As informal responses turned into formal routing, as direct explanation turned into redaction, clarity turned into familiar institutional delay of language, consultation and review. That's what changed. In that transition, there was not the evidence, because documents do not mutate when ballots are counted. Facts do not rearrange themselves after the oath is taken. And policy violations themselves do not evaporate when a title changes. That's what changed when the institutional cost of action, right? Because once elected, the sheriff himself becomes instantly operationally dependent on the very department whose chief, Lorraine, is now under scrutiny. Because he was under scrutiny until September. That Solo can say, I know, he's not sitting. I corrected that. My bad. He was until September, October, November, December. 3 months ago. Fuck off. Dude, really? Come on. Like a normal person could get that wrong. Any person. But hey, sheriff's departments rely on Lorain police for their arrest, the investigations, their evidence, their transport, their case construction, task force participation, interagency credibility. The fact that even the municipal court relied on them to transport their illegally arrested people like James Mauricio. And that courtroom visibility, while the prosecutor's office remains structurally dependent on that same police department, Lorain PD, for charging authority, witness development, and all evidentiary foundation for every case they did for over a year. Well, it'll be a year in January. We're like less than a month away. It's December 8th going on 9th. So 15, 21, and 1, 22, 23 days, right, until the new year. 23 days until Lorain City Council is supposed to have all their Brit and perk certificates done. Do you think they got them all done? No. And they're trying to change all the rules tonight. We're going to, for the record, there's going to be a new podcast coming out tomorrow night about all of the dumb shit they did in their podcast and in their records commission tonight, including they're planning on shutting down live meetings, folks. So I guess I'll have to be, all they're really saying is Aaron has to come to every meeting and live stream us. I got you, folks. I got you. I will come and live stream every meeting. I have this new little, all right, so for the record, I'm going to show you something. So, folks, I have ADHD and anxiety and all these things, but I also know if I'm not prepared, I'm fucked. So this is why I put up the stupid little code in the corner here, like, no, here from, wait. Yeah, here. Right there. If you scan that, you can donate. But this is the kind of shit that I use donations for, right? So tonight, I did this. I bought this. Everything else came. So we got our body cam. And, well, I can see it right here. We got our body cam. We got our flashlight, right? So before out of night, we can do this. But the last thing I got for live when we're online is this. And then we have this. Hook it up. Boom. I'm not going to do it right now so you see it, but light it. You know what? This, along with this, has all the information I need in it. On the back side, I also have this, which is my ID. Normally, it's factually attached to here because if you pull this all the way through, we have a. There we go. Boom. So. For the one person who did donate to the cause on that, that's what your money went to. Cameras, phones, amounts, everything. That right there will protect me so I can give you the story you need to hear. I can deal with the cops. I can deal with Lorain City Council. I can deal with anybody. I'll put that on. I'm sorry I didn't go tonight. All right, my bad. I've been feeling sad lately. I'm sorry, but I'm allowed to have feelings too. Well, they're not really feelings. Not really sad, just I don't like the weather. Problem is, like, we start looking at once the sheriff was elected, his office instantly became like the operationally dependent on the very department of his chief, and Lorain was like it. So once those dependencies lock into place, McCann's no longer merely a subject of review like he was when me and him were talking, right? Inside of the system, he becomes this load-bearing pillar inside the shared enforcement structure. He becomes I don't know, systems by their nature, they don't indict their own. Like, that's just dumb. They don't eat their own. That would ruin their foundation without, and without collapsing something else in the process. Because that moment that Hall becomes a sheriff, any movement against McCann no longer carried just only legal weight or consequences. It carried operational consequences. It carried political consequences. It carried interagency consequences. It carried the very real risk of destabilizing every case, every investigation, every arrest, and every joint operation that relied on McCann's department to function, right? They needed something more than just Aaron. What they really needed was Middlebrooks. Middlebrooks gave me Middlebrooks, and I gave Middlebrooks to you. Let's stop before we get in this next little section here. It's like, if you think Middlebrooks was the department or anyone, so Middlebrooks had all the documentation, including that extra bit, that AI report they didn't want released that had all the extra names in it. Now, you can argue, why would they give that to Middlebrooks? Either they were legally required or they accidentally did, but Middlebrooks would not give it to me. Middlebrooks was a good officer, like all of the other officers that came before him. He literally, even after McCann made him suck his balls, still had his back because he wouldn't give it to me himself. Baez wouldn't give it to me himself. Miguel. I love Baez, respect Baez, love his old partner. I love the job they do in the community. I don't even care that he was the one that let stupid ass Arroyo smoke. Dude, I'm mad that you made me call out Baez Arroyo. I don't like that. Because I like Baez. I support Baez. He's one of the few cops I support. So the fact you made me call him out because you're being a dumbass. Drink, do what you want to do, but don't do it on the cop car. You can't. Just follow the rules. Just follow the rules. Just follow the rules. Anyway, sorry, I'll get up. I digress. So that operation required and relied on McCann, right, to function until September when he quit. That's the part the public never sees. That's the part that public sees elections. Well, the system's interlocking dependency it becomes, but that's where the silence itself becomes strategic and rather than accidental, right? It becomes, once the cost of action becomes higher than the cost of inaction, institutions don't hesitate. They freeze, they delay, they reroute, they bury any issues inside the layers of review. They rename suppression as process. They rename avoidance as discretion. They rename silence as proofs. Well, and this is why the shift after the election wasn't chaotic, wasn't orderly, not emotional, but calibrated, not personal, but structural. Because that same question and the same questions that once received direct responses now required formal submission. The same documents that once operated and were appeared to be obtainable now required prolonged legal review. Records. Same issues that once generated concern now generate delay because he's the sheriff. And none of it happened with hostility. Because he's the sheriff, he's the prosecutor. So it happened with this professionalism that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Because professionalism can be weaponized, just as I do, everyone does. As effectively a safe force when the objective to itself is actually to slow a case until public attention fades. They count on you forgetting about Hall. They count on you for forgetting about anyone. All right, so let's go over some counts. So everybody hated me for bringing out Coonrad, but the reason why I knew about Coonrad was because of Hall's people. Everybody hated me about bringing out, I don't want to say his name, but the guy in Sheffield Lake who passed away. I'm torn on this because as a human, as a law enforcement officer, as a husband, as a father, he deserves that respect beyond all belief of anyone. I don't care about what I've said in the past. That is it. His daughter deserves to hear that he was a hero. And he was. I'll give him that. But occasionally, even heroes fuck up. He fucked up with me. Not because of anything overt, but because of people like Tia and other Lorraine Ritchie who brought a negativity to me that they carried with them from other situations. But it's fine. Because professionals become dangerous because professionals can be weaponized just as effectively as force when the objective is to slow a case beyond that public attention, right? Until it fades, like all of our attentions fade. Witnesses, they get tired. Momentum, it collapses. Just like in the Nancy Smith case. The cost of continued exposure becomes socially inconvenient. And it did so back then, more so, maybe less so than it does now, because now it's in your fucking face. Every time you open your Facebook page, right? In the face. Every time you open your Facebook page, you look at her and you go, oh my God, look at Amber. And there she is talking. And now she's, in your mind, a person. She's this human. You see this cute little woman who's standing there at a mic and a podium articulating herself. And you go, well, where was this person? Well, she was always there, but she was always socially inconvenient to the rest of you. So the turning point in this whole story really is that it was never about the truth actually changing, because the truth didn't change. Amber didn't change. The documents didn't change. Her mom's crimes that were non-existent didn't change. The contradictions didn't change. The violations didn't change. The only thing that fucking changed was the price of movement, like the price of moving your pawn. And once that price became visible, it doubled inside the institutional ledger, so to speak. Once those consequences of accountability, they were quietly weighed against the consequences of silence. Silence and stillness became the safest option available to everyone who now shared that operational structure. Think about that. Look at the Montalon thing. Why did he have to say it quietly? Why did he have to whisper? Why did Sal Rivera have to trick Amber Bronish, Amber Smith at the time probably, into recording him? I don't care what Amber says or anyone says or these reporters say. This is my job. If you want me to believe that Sal Rivera handed a tape recorder to Amber Bronish, Amber Smith, and said, hey, go record every witness in this case, you'll find something out. So he knew. We already know he knew because he doubted it. He said it in the tapes. But imagine you're a man. You got guilt. You got sadness. You got hurt. You got heartbreak. You know this. You said it. The most damaging statement ever said was when she was convicted that I knew, because innocent people don't act that way. So he did nothing. And all the time Amber's talking to him, he's conveniently ignoring himself in the videos. I get that. We do that, right? I want to be the hero. I got to be the hero of my own story. I can't be the villain. But he got played. Maybe they had something on him. I don't know. God rest his soul. He got a street named after him. Good for you, so. You still helped a woman who was innocent behind bars. And in your finest hour, the finest hour that you ever owned in your life was when you came forward and gave Amber Bronish that fucking tape recorder. You guys can say what you want about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Never a moment that's more clear in my life as God, karma, whatever power you want to believe. He felt guilty. He handed that recorder to her and said, tape record me. He said, tape record the evidence, the witnesses. Well, he was a witness. So you only believe he didn't know? I mean, maybe he didn't. Maybe he was surprised when Montalon exposed him. No, he wasn't. He fucking knew. He couldn't do it on his own. He didn't have the wills. Amber's got bigger balls than any of you people. That's kind of why I like her. She's got big balls and you cannot lie. You other ones can't deny. When Amber walks in, she'll jack you up and she'll take... I'm just kidding. But that's the consequences of accountability. They're quietly weighed. They look at the consequences of silence. They go, oh, which one's worse? 6, 7. That silence, that stillness, it becomes the safest option until it's not. So Now, everyone has shared this operational exposure inside the same enforcement structure. And in systems like this, that safety does not mean justice, it means survival. So now we're on Act 6, folks. I know, as usual, we're getting a little long, but we're going to go about 2 hours or so. And that Act 6 is the case that should have never moved and never did, right? That's the post-election inertia, the prosecutorial gravity, and the mechanics of non-action. We're going to get into how the post-election issue was silent, and that silence set in. Hall, Solo, people that once shared with me like we were brothers, treated me as if I were once supporting Rich Resendez. The pain was real for me. I was asked once by the court, and they said, "Aaron, what do you want us to do for you?" This was after they took away my guardian ad litem. This is my first job as a social worker. They destroyed me. McCann, everyone, they fucking just destroyed me. I asked Michelle, my boss, "Are you asking me to ignore the code of ethics?" No. Telling you, if you continue on this path, they could refuse to work with you. And they did. Now, folks, if you're at all five of you, if you're, or anybody that watches after this, if you're at all interested, look up the Valentine Act in Ohio. Applewood holds a majority of all the jobs in the county of Lorain. So when you ask Aaron why Aaron can't work with these fucking degrees that allow him to be a good counselor, a good therapist, a good anything that I set my mind to, and I want to, and it's for minimal money. I just need my stupid $50,000, $60,000 a year job. Nothing, right? These cops are making 180. But no, can't have that, right? So once that post-election silence sets in, once that access transformed into routing, once the responses became review and urgency became discretion, what followed was not chaos, not confrontation, not even denial in the traditional sense, so to speak, but something far more durable, far more difficult to fight, which is institutional inertia, right? Disguised as responsible restraint, a slow-moving gravitational field that pulls every active inquiry into a holding pattern where nothing officially dies, but nothing really moves forward. And it's at this stage that it didn't really disappear, it just lost velocity. And that distinction matters because disappearance triggers scrutiny, right? And stagnation simply exhausts patience. It drains momentum, it weakens witnesses, it dulls that public attention. And it quietly converts urgency into this background noise, all while preserving the actual outward appearance of procedural legitimacy. The referrals were still technically open, the communications were still technically being routed, the materials were all still technically under review, but nothing really moved with intent, right? That's what makes this space so difficult for me and for anyone, is to confront this, is that no one has a say, right? No one has to say no. No one has to reject the case on its merits. No one has to even refute the evidence. No one has to expose themselves to risking being wrong or even seen as obstructing justice. Because silence itself, from Solo, from Hall, from all the players, becomes the decision. The delay itself becomes the verdict. The time itself becomes the shield. At this stage, Hall doesn't fucking speak as a candidate, and Solo no longer evaluates as an outsider, because now both of these assholes occupy offices that sit directly inside that same operational bloodstream as the department that's under scrutiny, which means every movement forward threatens to transmit shock through the entire enforcement network that now depends on functional harmony to survive politically and operationally. They got to do what they got to do. It's true. They do. So, because prosecutions don't exist in isolation, they require officers to testify, they require departments to cooperate, they require evidence change to remain intact, they require institutional credibility to remain unfractured. And in any case that targets a sitting chief does not just simply threaten one man, right? It threatens the reliability of thousands of prior arrests, the stability of ongoing investigations, It threatens the admissibility of evidence already moving through the system in the courtrooms. It starts to threaten the public confidence in that actual system itself. It acts if it's actually functional rather than compromised. So the new calculation for everyone becomes quietly. It replaces the original legal analysis not spoken publicly. You can't say that shit out loud. Not formally, but it's internally understood that even if the evidence is strong, even if the violations are documented, even if the referrals are supported, the collateral damage of enforcement kind of now outweighs the whole institutional appetite for the truth. Meaning it's going to cost us more than we're hungry for. So that's the idea of where this slam dunk case sort of dissolves that I had into this reality of the organizational risk management, right? Hall, so they're part of the system that they weren't before. Before they were criticizing the system, now they are the system. And at that point, the public record begins to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Because requests that once produced partial compliance now produce clarification requests. Clarification requests now produce review notices. Review notices now produce extension notices. Extension notices now produce silence. All the while, the clock actually continues to run forward against the very people who are still waiting for accountability, me and others. This is not how justice fails loudly, right? It's how justice dissolves quietly. And because nothing overtly illegally appears on the surface of the delay itself, right? Because process can always be cited as justification. I mean, like as justification, like we know what that requires, right? I feel like that requires a little
A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit. A bullshit.
the system will always retain plausible deniability, while the practical effect mirrors outright suppression just as completely as anything. On this stage, that case no longer becomes moving through an active opposition and becomes absorbed through this procedural sediment, like shit you'd see in, I don't know, ninth grade Earth history, layered in their memos and policy reviews and internal decisions and discussions and inter-office consultations that never really reach final resolution, because the final resolution requires somebody, anybody, anywhere along the line to actually accept ownership of these fucking consequences. And nobody wants those. They don't want to own the consequences at this stage, right? Not politically, not administratively, not institutionally. Because to move forward now would force a reckoning that not only with McCann, but with every joint operation, every task force, partnership, every charging decision, every affidavit, every collaboration that grew on top of that foundation. Systems that grow on compromised ground really choose excavation over concealment. It's fact. Even though they're covered by it, the result is like a static equilibrium where everyone appears responsible while nobody appears accountable or is accountable. That's where the review replaces decision, the prudence replaces courage, and where delay denies justice without ever needing to announce anyone that the substitution was made publicly. Because from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. From the inside, it looks like something very specific is fucking happening. Survival logic has fully replaced the reform logic. Risk minimization has replaced truth seeking. Containment has replaced correction. And this is the phase where whistleblowers like me are not attacked aggressively anymore, right? They're outweighted. They administratively starve us. They procedurally exhaust us. They bury us beneath calendars and deadlines, extensions, and reviews that never quite resolve this judgment, right? And that's the moment when a case becomes truly dangerous. Not because it's volatile, but because it disappears without ever being dismissed. Leaving the public with no verdict, no closure, no declaration, and no official acknowledgement that the decision was ever made. That's exactly and precisely why this case did not die loudly. Now we're at Act 6, we're going to get into the bar photo, the question, the answer, and the full extent of everything we're going to talk about. There's a moment when the entire arc of the story in the case stops acting as theory and speculation and rumor, or even behind the scenes inference, right? Instead, it exists as this fully visible, publicly documented collision between the institutional power of the government, unresolved allegations from public, and personal consequences. At that moment, it doesn't arrive through a count filing or a police report, but it arrives, in my opinion, in this case, on a photograph taken at a St. Patrick's Day bar that quietly reshaped the gravity of everything we followed. That image surfaced showing Sheriff Jack Hall standing alongside Chief James McCann in a public social setting. The meaning of that image was not abstract to me, and it was not merely political theater. Because at that exact moment, that photograph entered public circulation. My sworn affidavit already existed. My criminal complaints were formally pending. My public records requests were stalled inside the law department review. My filings were being routed through the same institutional framework that remained operationally dependent on McCann, on the system itself that was already in possession of evidence that already had placed McCann under unresolved scrutiny in his own investigations with Middlebrooks. So what that photograph communicated was, whether intentionally or not, was not neutrality, not distance, not restraint, not institutional caution, not visible proximity between the sheriff and the police chief at the precise moment when due process required functional separation. No, right? Because optics become procedural when power is being displayed during unresolved legal exposure, and proximity becomes posture when justice is not yet spoken. Community over something else. Community over community over TF. No. But the problem is that image carried implications no press release could ever erase. I did what the system itself had refused to do at that point. I confronted the posture directly by asking the sheriff about it personally. Not through lawyers, not through intermediaries, but not even through court phones. On the phone. Called him up. Say, Jack, a lot of people are saying XYZ about what you did there. What do you say? What's your statement? Because I was seeking an explanation that might restore some confidence in this neutrality. His response, as I remember it, was in a sarcastic tone, kind of a quote. And he said, yeah. I believe him. He sounded curious. I drove all the way from Columbia Station just to shake his hand. Now, keep friends close and the rest closer. And in sort of a quote, a statement, I'm kind of recounting from my direct recollection of that exchange. It's not an interpretation, just not as an inference, but as words that were spoken to me when I asked why that public alignment existed, why my case remained unresolved. At that moment, the photo ceased to be ambiguous, because when the public posture is later explained through private rhetoric that invokes proximity, strategy, and closeness rather than separation, independence, or restraint, that system no longer retains that actual benefit of interpretive doubt. This is not a question of friendship, not a question of coincidence, or even a question of procedural contamination through public posture. That was reinforced by personal explanation, because when the sheriff publicly appears beside the actual subject of the unresolved allegations, and then privately frames that proximity in strategic terms rather than neutral ones, the boundary between investigation and alignment ceases to exist in any meaningful form or public sense. From that moment forward, the institutional silence no longer read as caution, but as consolidation. Because institutional silence before that exchange could be interpreted as delay, internal conflict, bureaucratic slowness. But institutional silence after that exchange transformed into perceived protection, perceived insulation, perceived unwillingness to disturb the center of gravity inside this world, inside this enforcement hierarchy they had developed. And once that perception takes hold, right, every unanswered question, every unanswered request or records request, every stalled charging decision, they just vanish. Every vanished line of investigative communication, every unpolished or unexplained procedural pause inside the prosecutor's office became inseparable from the image and that of the explanation that followed it, right? Because the human mind does not parse legal nuance faster than it recognizes power choosing proximity over separation. My uncle's a lawyer. I know this shit. He was a Supreme Court lawyer in California, a brilliant man. My mom was an English teacher, a brilliant woman. I only hope one day to be as smart as they are. But from that point forward, the system itself was no longer merely failing to speak. It was actually being seen. The power itself was being seen as is explained. Explanation almost never catches up. Well, Judge Evers triggered the system, and he did so when, on August 29th of 2025, we crossed the threshold, me and him together. Like, the system itself can never credibly claim it failed to recognize, because on that date, August 2029 of 2025, 8/29/2025, I issued a sworn affidavit in support of criminal charges formally filed against James McCann under 2935.09. That's not a protest document. That's not a political statement. It's not a media tactic. It's a grievance letter. Not even that, right? It's a legally defined mechanism that forces allegations out of the realm of informal complaint, as they kept trying to take it, and directly into the judicial channel where they are governed by statute rather than decision. The affidavit was not casual in its construction, not vague in its content. It wasn't speculative in its scope, because it was sworn under penalty of perjury. I did it. I'm a therapist. I'm a licensed social worker. Swore. Structured under statutory authority. Supported by documentation. Filed precisely because in all informal routes and informal routes that I tried of enforcement and oversight and correction with Tony Sowell had failed. Been settled or stalled, or redacted or redirected from meaningful resolution. Only days later, on September 3rd, 2025, Judge Evers reviewed that affidavit and issued a formal referral to the Lorraine County prosecutor under Ohio Revised Code 2935.10. And at this point, it cannot be softened or reinterpreted without distorting the law itself, because a referral under that statute is not ceremonial. It's not ceremonial language. What it is not optional language. It's procedural trigger. It activates a mandatory duty on the prosecuting authority, Tony Sowell, to make an actual charging determination. That was 96 days ago. 96 fucking days ago. Oh, well, we have no... Fuck off. You've had since the first of the year. You're lazy, Tony. You don't want to address it because you know it's the only case you can actually close, because you damn sure can't close the one on JD. You tried. I think like 3 times. But hey, that's why it's amazing. There is no third option written into that statute, right? There's no allowance for indefinite assessment, 96 days. There's no statutory permission for administrative drift. There's no language that authorizes silence. There's no language that authorizes silence. None. The law contemplates only 2 paths. 2. Forward, once that referral is issued. Either a criminal investigation is formally opened, or a formal written declination of prosecution is issued. That can itself be reviewed, challenged, or appealed through lawful means. That's why I want that declination. Either he's recused, or it gives me the declination. But either way, he's not touching this fucking case. Because Tony Sowell, in my opinion, is just as corrupt as the system he belongs to. He can say what he wants, but he won't give me any of the things that's legally required constitutionally, so why would I believe otherwise? As I told my daughters, when you lie to me and continuously lie to me, why do I believe you? So even after that judicial trigger was pulled, I did. the system did not move visibly in either direction, right? Days had passed, weeks had passed, months had begun to accumulate. We're in 96 days. A formal status inquiry I just submitted back to the same court in order to determine whether statutory obligations actually imposed by the judge's referral had been satisfied in any form at all. And if there was no written confirmation that any investigation had been opened, no disclosure of a named reviewing prosecutor, no formal declaration placed into the record, no conflict referral sent to an outside jurisdiction, no functioning communication pathway that allowed either the complainant or the court to determine what, if anything, was happening behind the closed door procedure chain of procedural curtain. What existed was silence. Not loud silence, not defiant silence, but controlled institutional silence. The most dangerous kind, right? Because institutional silence borrows the appearance of legitimacy while it quietly dissolves accountability over time. And that silence placed the entire matter into the legal condition that Ohio Revised Code itself does not recognize as valid. Indefinite procedural fucking limbo, just like Joseph Smith and Nancy Allen. Like where no deadlines visibly run, where no denials are firmly issued, where no appeals may be taken, where nothing is technically accepted and nothing is technically rejected, where the appearance of legality is preserved while the substance of justice is softly suspended. Procedural limbo never operates neutrally in a system built on power and balance, because it doesn't burden institutions the way that it burdens private citizens. It doesn't exhaust authority like in the way that it exhausts complaints. It does not pressure those who control the outcomes the way it pressures those who wait for them. Procedural limbo benefits only the parties who are already possess the institutional power, because power is uniquely equipped to survive those kind of answers and without answers, while those without power are forced to spend time, resources, credibility, and emotional endurance simply to locate the basic status of their own sworn filing. And this is the point in the story where the system does not merely appear slow. It appears self-protective, because delay without explanation is not neutrality. It's actually control exercised through time. So we're going to add 8 real quick. We're going to take a quick pause for station identification. We'll be back to finish up our last few episodes, acts, and then we'll be done for the night. In the meantime, please pay attention to our ads, and thank you for coming here tonight.
Here at Unplugged with Aaron Knapp, we like to thank our sponsors. We have a few unofficial sponsors tonight, and they are definitely not paid sponsorships. I want to throw out there a big thank you to Joseph Jones and Eric Jones of the Lorraine Daily and the Vermilion Daily. They have a local news page. You should check them out. They do plenty of great work broadcasting all the news that is the news that you want to have in Lorain and Lorain County. So check them out. Also, please, if you need any legal services, feel free to reach out to Robert Gargas. You can find him listed online. He's a fine attorney and comes highly recommended by yours truly. And last but not least, I want to mention DNC Radio. Please make sure you check out one of the up-and-coming internet hip-hop stations and all of their shows. They put on a lot of shows. You have the Never Outdone show. You also have the Eric Bowen show, Speak Up, Speak Out. So please make sure you guys check them out as well if you're looking for your latest and up-to-date hip-hop artistry. Thank you for tuning in. This has been a non-paid sponsorship brought to you by Unplugged with Aaron Knapp. Here
Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polish decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polish decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask.
All right there, folks. Welcome back. Here we are to Act 8. The record suppression that became the operating system for how silence is manufactured through Oliver Lorraine, right? This is a process they've developed over years. And I kind of realized it once I was going through some paperwork, but once this whistleblower inversion fully takes hold and the person insisting on accountability, like me, becomes the problem, that must be managed rather than the misconduct itself, right? The final and most durable layer of this insulation quietly settles into place. That layer is record suppression. Well, I've seen it, God, for 2 years straight. Other people are seeing it now, but it's not an emergency response. It's not as a one-time denial. It's not as reactive obstruction, right? They're not doing it intentionally in one little way or another, but it's normalized. It's an operating system. It's like through time and access and documentation, it's been regulated until transparency itself becomes so friggin' structurally unreachable. And at this stage, nobody needs to destroy records, right? No one needs to falsify documents. None of these city officials or county officials or anyone needs to overtly refuse access in a way that would draw immediate judicial scrutiny, because suppression involves almost something far more sophisticated than it's ever been and far more legally survivable, I suppose, which is fragmentation, delay, routing, exemption, stacking, custodial confusion, partial production, rolling production, redaction, saturation, procedural exhaustion. All of these things are delayed and like deployed in combinations that preserve the appearance of compliance while achieving the practical effect of denial. Right? That's it. And that's key, because you got to understand, like, this where requests no longer receive that simple yes or no answer. They see this maze of acknowledgments. And I've seen it. I've seen it in my requests, but you guys got to realize my inbox is full. And for the record, there's 3 of you in my inbox right now wanting to tell your stories. I promise I'll tell them. I think that's going to be my new bit. We're going to tell people's untellable stories. We're going to get you guys out there and, just know if I can't actually confirm the story, I'm not going to confirm that it's true. We'll tell it like a true crime podcast, but gotta have some truth to it, folks. Don't lie to me. If you come to me with some fucking lies, you're out. If I find that you lied to me, you can kick rocks. But that's where requests, they no longer receive this simple yes or no. They enter this maze of acknowledgments, right? And at every stage, every email has to be routed. Every request has to be reviewed. The law department, however, every review must be consulted. Every consultation must be documented. Every document must be redacted. And each of those steps carries its own elastic timeline, right? Snap, 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 snap. Its own justification for delay, its own procedural dignity. And that makes challenge feel premature. Even when months have passed, the effect is cumulative. Because the first delay feels incidental, right? First, it's like, oh, whatever. Second delay, all right, okay, I get you. The third one, you're like, all right, fucker. Oh, we're down to 1. Shit. The fourth delay feels inevitable. And then somewhere between the 5th and the 6th, transparency stops feeling like expected, and it actually starts feeling unrealistic. Not because the law changed, but because the psychology of expectation has been quietly reconditioned. We're thinking differently. And that's what makes this phase nearly untouchable in every single component of suppression that can individually be defended as reasonable, while the total outcome is catastrophically unreasonable. With all of us, Garen, me, Amber, Amber's mom, James, because each delay can be justified on its own, and yet the full sequence of produces this permanent blackout without ever announcing that a blackout occurred. Kind of like when the 911 calls went out when Bobert went down. Like, they act like they don't want to act like there's a record that occurred. You guys failed them. Regardless of my feelings about him, you failed them. We thought there was a we thought you blacked out the 911 because that's who you are. To only find out you blacked it out, not because who you are, but because it was literally blacked out because you didn't know what you were doing and you're 911 down. Thanks, commissioners. Just what they said would happen, right? Kind of have that out there. But records disappear without being destroyed. Evidence fades without being erased. Accountability is neutralized without being denied, right? And it's at that stage that the greatest inversion takes place. Because now the burden silently shifts away from the agency that controls the records, sheriffs, LPD, prosecutor, and settles instead on the individual who must somehow prior prove that the records are being suppressed without having access to the actual records to prove it. Me. So, at this point, the person requesting documentation is forced to litigate. Blind. Me. To challenge invisibility without being allowed to see what's invisible. To argue against redactions without being allowed to know what was redacted. And to contrast exemptions with being allowed to test the factual basis, which is how suppression itself becomes self-sealing. This is not an accident of workload, folks. It's a result of a clerical overload. It's not actually the result of a clerical overload. It's not even the inevitable friction of government. It is an engineered environment in which delay is the enforcement tool, right? Delay, deny until they die. Ambiguity, it's the shield. And exhaustion becomes the outcome. By the time the space fully matures, the original misconduct no longer needs protection, right? Through force or confrontation, because by the time you get to the end, it's now protected through paperwork, through calendars, through reviews, through consultations, and through infinite elasticity of process itself. I'm just saying, like, if only a girl could get that long of a denial. Anyway, the public only sees the waiting, and the waiting is without a visible villain, gradually silences even the loudest of all the cases, until only people still remember, like, what was requested are the ones who are actually forced to ask, like, or stop asking for their own survival. All right, so we get to Act 9. That's the cost of the human cost of this actual waiting that we're dealing with. Like, when record suppression begins, the operating system and delay becomes this official node or mode of engagement. The damage actually follows is no longer dramatic, cinematic, or even immediately visible, right, to the public, because it does not arrive with sirens or headlines or indictments or courtrooms or declarations. It slowly arrives and quietly arrives inside the nervous system, inside your financial stability, inside relationships, inside physical health, and the long-term capacity of a person to remain upright, while a case that should have moved continues to hover indefinitely in institutional suspension. Garen Petty, Nancy Smith, James Mauricio. I could list more, but institutional delay does not merely stall justice in the abstract sense. It relocates the full weight of the unresolved directly onto the body of life of the person who was forced to carry it forward through time without verdict. James Mauricio, Garen Petty. Without, Amber Smith, Nancy Smith, all of them. Joseph. Without closure, without validation, without relief, without the institution itself, it remains structurally insulated against the urgency by design, because urgency only exists for those who have actually something to lose, right? The victims, who became the non-victims. The institution has already calculated it didn't have anything to lose. That's what makes this form of damage so difficult for the public and people to understand or comprehend. Nothing outwardly appears to be happening, right? Because delay leaves no visible bruise, no audible confession, no written admission of guilt, and yet internally the consequences are cumulative and relentless. Because every unanswered request leaves behind a residue of this uncertainty Every redaction leaves behind a gap that cannot be filled. Every extension notice prolongs the psychological state of unresolved threat, and every quiet non-response forces the mind to remain permanently anchored to a moment that was actually supposed to pass. This is the hidden toll, folks, of procedural silence, because it destabilizes income as stability. It depends on predictability, and no one can actually plan a long-term plan when the future remains institutionally unresolved, like Amber. If you can't know you'll be skating next summer, how can you plan to skate next summer? You stole it. So it destabilizes health because chronic uncertainty keeps the body trapped in continuous low-grade stress, sociologically, psychologically, everything proven. This process that never fully shuts off, right? It destabilizes relationships because the people closest to the waiting individual can support presence, but they can't sustain indefinite suspension without consequence. It destabilizes the identity because when a case becomes frozen in time, the individual becomes frozen in shadow, like Amber. She's finally becoming Amber again, and now you guys are trying to steal it from her again. No longer are they permitted to move forward, unburdened by the unresolved. None of these costs ever appeared on a docket, right? None of them appeared in memos. None of them appear to be in administrative blogs or logs, or none of them appeared on polished language, the official correspondence, because the manifest only is seen as attrition, as fatigue, as isolation, as burnout, and as the gradual erosion of capacity that no medical chart can ever fully explain, becomes the injury that was never a single traumatic event, but rather an extended exposure to unresolved institutional indifference. That's where the cruelty of delay reveals itself. That's where, because the institution itself never has to declare an enemy, never has to declare a verdict, never has to declare wrongdoing, never has to explain the failure or the individual that's forced to live with the indefinite, indefinitely inside the suspended narrative where resolution is always implied but never delivered, where the promise of accountability always is a tool of the restraint and rather than relief. And as the years stretch on, the social environment just shifts around, like the person is waiting as well, because attention spans shorten, new scandals arrive, new administrations rotate in, public memory fades. We forget. That's why I'm reminding you now about Amber Smith, Nancy Smith, Amber Brothers, whatever you want to call them. And eventually that they cease to become described as old news without ever having become resolved news. That's the most efficient eraser mechanism available to any power structure operating under the appearance of law, because nothing fully disappears. It simply dissolves into this irrelevance through repetition of inaction. Don't let this case become that. For no other reason to look at Amber Broner's skate, to see the childhood that was stolen from a young woman, to see the children that were stolen from a mother in Nancy Smith, and see the career, maybe even the Monthlon, that was derailed by honesty. I'm going to give this guy his props. Yeah, I'm not happy he shared some shit he probably shouldn't have, but he saw nothing else, right? He couldn't see beyond that, because he too saw what Sell and McCann and all these people recognized, because they realized that the longer the process persists, the easier it becomes for outsiders to misinterpret this exhaustion as disengagement, silence that we give as surrender when people don't speak, and restraint as defeat, without ever understanding that the cost of continued resistance is no longer merely legal or political or biological, but emotional, financial, existential. Because at this stage, the waiting itself is actually the punishment, and the unresolved becomes the sentence. That's why institutional delay is not neutral, it's not passive, it's not accidental, because it functions as a form of quiet enforcement that extracts time instead of blood, resources instead of liberty, and endurance instead of confession. And by the time the public actually realizes how much of it has been taken, the only thing left to measure is what can't be returned. We're almost here at the end, folks. On our Section 9, we're going to record suppression when it becomes the operating system, the delay that becomes the official mode of engagement. The delay and the damage that follows is no longer dramatic, it's cinematic or even immediately visible to the public because it does not arrive with sirens, headlines, indictments, or courtroom declarations, but actually instead seeps quietly into the infrastructure of a human life through disrupted sleep cycles, fractured financial planning, strained relationships, interrupted healthcare, stalled professional trajectories, and a nervous system that never quite again is permitted to return fully to baseline because the future itself has been locked inside this procedural uncertainty. Because institutional delay does not merely stall justice in an abstract civic instance or sense, it actually relocates it, the full unresolved weight of the case, in any case, directly onto the body and daily existence of the person who's forced to actually carry it forward. Through this time, without a verdict, without closure, without validation, without any sort of relief, and while the institution itself remains structurally insulated against any sort of urgency by design, any sort of urgency because it is reserved only for those with something to lose. The institution has already calculated that it does not. And what makes this form so damaged, right? That it makes this form of damage so difficult to understand or for the public to comprehend is that nothing outward appears to be happening because delay leaves no visible bruise, no audible confession, no public admission of fault, no single catastrophic moment that forces recognition. Yet internally, the consequences are cumulative and relentless because every unanswered request leaves behind a residue of unresolved anticipation. Every redaction leaves some sort of some sort of interpretive wound that cannot be closed. Every extension notice that we prolong the psychology of a state of the perceived or suspended threat, and every quiet non-response forces the mind to remain permanently anchored to a moment that was never allowed to pass, ever. That's the hidden toll of procedural silence, folks. That's because it destabilizes income and stability depends on predictability, and nobody can responsibly plan long term when it comes to the future that institutionally has unresolved it. It destabilizes health. It becomes chronic. Uncertainty traps the body in a continuous low grade stress cycle that responds only that never fully deactivates. It just slowly begins to manifest as fatigue, inflammation, sleep disruption, cardiovascular strain, immune suppression, and cognitive fog, and then destabilizes relationships because the people closest to the waiting individual can provide compassion and presence, but they cannot indefinitely absorb the gravitational pull of the unresolved threat without eventually experiencing their own secondary exhaustion. And it destabilizes identity because when a case becomes frozen in time, like the land of the lost, the individual becomes frozen inside its shadow, no longer socially permitted to move forward, unburdened by the unresolved. And none of these costs ever appear on a docket. They don't appear in court transcripts. They don't appear in case management systems. None of them appear in polished language of official correspondence because they manifest only as attrition rather than explosion, as erosion rather than catastrophe, as burnout rather than spectacle, and as the gradual thinning of resilience, and that no medical chart can ever really fully document because the injury was never a single traumatic event, but rather a extended exposure to unresolved institutional indifference. And that's where this cruelty of this delay reveals itself most clearly. The institution itself never has to declare an enemy. It never has to confront a verdict. It never has to admit wrongdoing. It never has to explain failure. It never has to, while the individual may be forced to live indefinitely inside this suspended narrative of you did wrong, you did this, you did that, the resolution is always implied but never delivered, where the promise of accountability becomes a tool of restraint rather than a mechanism of relief. And over the years, as they stretch on, the social environment begins to shift around persons who maybe are waiting, as well as attention spans shorten, new scandals arrive, new administrations routine in, new controversies eclipse the old ones, public memory decays through saturation, and eventually the unresolved case becomes described as the old news without ever having become resolved news. That that's the most efficient erasure mechanism available to any power structure operating under the appearance of law, because nothing ever has to be fully disappeared, right? It simply dissolves into irrelevance and through repetition of inaction. And the longer this process persists, the easier it becomes for outsiders to misinterpret exhaustion as disengagement, surrender and silence as surrender, and restraint as defeat. Because every understanding that the cost of continuing resistance is no longer really legal or political or biological, but emotional, financial, existential. Because at that stage, the waiting itself becomes the punishment, and the unresolved becomes the sentence. And this is why institutional delay is not neutral, not passive, not accidental, but it's functioning. It functions, and it functions as a form of quiet enforcement that extracts time instead of blood, and savings instead of liberty, relationships instead of freedom, and endurance instead of confession. And by the time the public finally realizes how much has been stolen from them, the only thing left to do is to measure what can never be returned, folks. We'll never get it back. So as we get to Act 10, the pattern repeats. Montalon, Nancy Smith, McCann, Petty. Take a quick break, and we'll be right back to finish up, hopefully soon.
Hey there, folks. If you really want to know what's happening in your hometown, the place to go is Lorain Daily and Vermilion Daily. From city council and school boards to local businesses, community events, and neighborhood stories, these outlets cover what the big media ignores. This is hyper-local news for real people in real communities. Visit Lorain Daily and VermilionDaily.com today. Read it, share it, support local journalism, because your community deserves coverage that actually lives here. Hey there, folks. If you really want to know what's happening in your hometown, the place to go is Lorain Daily and Vermilion Daily. From city council and school boards to local businesses, community events, and neighborhood stories, these outlets cover what the big media ignores. This is hyper-local news for... Hey there, folks. DNC Radio is your home for real conversations, real community voices, and independent radio that doesn't answer to the corporate filters or political scripts. From music to live talk, community issues to uncensored discussion, DNC Radio is powered by the people, not the algorithms. If you're tired of sanitized media and ready for something real, tune into DNC Radio. You can follow and listen right now at Facebook.com/DNC Radio OH. That's Facebook.com/DNC Radio OH.
Hello there, guys. We're back. We're going to finish this one up. We're on Act 10, folks. The pattern that repeats. Montalon. God, your name keeps coming up. Nancy Smith, McCann, Petty. So, by the time the system has placed one individual into some sort of indefinite procedural suspension, the public is often encouraged to believe that the situation is unfortunate but isolated, right? Rare, accidental, like Rivera and all the other things. Uniquely complicated. You know what? I apologize. I should have grabbed a drink while we were on break. I'm going to grab one real quick. All right, we're back. Sorry about that. Anyway, we're gonna get right back to this. All right, how do we get us back up there? There we go. All right, so by the time this was not back on 10. So public is often encouraged to believe that The situation is unfortunate, right? But isolated, rare, accidental even, uniquely complicated. All these things are. Rivera, McCann, Middlebrooks. When that same structural behaviors began appearing across separate names, separate timelines, separate accusations, separate institutional interactions, this illusion of coincidence collapses under its own weight. Because suddenly it's no longer a story of mismanagement, right? It's an exposure of a repeatable operational pattern. Because Montalon didn't exist in a vacuum. This guy was doing what he was doing for a reason. Nancy Smith didn't suffer in isolation. And McCann didn't emerge out of nowhere. Just like Petty didn't become entangled by accident. I have all of McCann's files. But each of these names appears on different points, at different points in time on my timeline, with different service facts. Yet beneath the surface of all these differences, the same institutional mechanics repeat themselves time and time again. Mechanical consistency, because the system responds not to innocence or guilt, right? But to a threat, an exposure, or proximity to power. That's it, folks. That's all it does. I really want to make sure I can see. There used to be a way I could see all your stuff in here. I want to see your guys' posts. So right now I don't have it set up where I can see. Whatever. Oh, wait, comments. Look at that. Amazing. Garen, thank you for letting me learn. Just want to see what the comments said. I had a way of doing this the other night. I apologize. I'm still learning a lot of these features like my banners. I keep changing these because here's one. I have multiples. But anyway, I apologize. I get a little bit misdirected on occasion, and I do apologize because in the grand scheme of things, it's what makes this kind of fun. But all right, who do we get? None of them are accidental, especially Garen. None of them. Why I know Montalon? Why Amber mentioned Montalon? Is God guiding me? I don't know. All I know is that each of these names appear at different points in time with different surface stacks, and yet beneath those surface differences is the same institutional mechanics that only I see. They repeat themselves with mechanical consistency, right? Because the system responds not to innocent or guilt. They don't give a fuck if you're innocent or guilty. All they care about is threat, exposure, and proximity to that power. Montalon, his case, became a lesson in how quickly urgency evaporates once procedural complexity can be invoked. Because at the moment when clarity was most needed, when layers of review were multiplied, jurisdiction blurred, responsibility diffused, and the appearance of motion replaced actual movement, allowing time itself to become the enforcement mechanism rather than the law. Nancy Smith's life became a living demonstration of how long a person can be made to wait without formal resolution, while the state itself remains structurally protected from any consequence by continuity of personnel, shifting of narratives, quiet exhaustion, public attention. Because her case didn't move slowly and metabolize, right, into the background noise of an institution that never had to explain itself. McCann's presence inside this whole pattern is not defined only by his actions, but by his institutional response to these actions, right? Because scrutiny itself does not actually produce swift adjudication. Instead, triggered the same reflexive behaviors that we're seeing elsewhere, including record suppression, internal routing, delayed disclosure, conflict assertions, strategic silence, all of which serve to transform exposure into containment from McCann. And then Petty comes into the same architecture, right? Garen rolls in here like a big dick in a locker room, and not as an anomaly, but as a confirmation. Because once, again, allegations intersected this protected zones of influence, all these people have their sacred circles. Once again, process becomes delayed. Once again, authority becomes insulation. Once again, the resolution becomes suspended inside systems that actually excel at absorbing pressure without actually releasing answers. No, what unites these names is not some sort of service detail of each case being identical, or the structure choreography, or it appears after the ignition point, right? What comes first is institutional quiet. And then comes proactive and procedural layering. Then comes jurisdictional diffusion. Then comes exhaustion, right? Then comes normalization of an unresolved status. Finally, that slow disappearance of any urgency itself. And that's why this moment where isolation gives like way to recognition, right? Because only one person installed, the system can call it complexity. But when multiple names are shared across multiple years and the same administrative shadows, complexity collapses, and and continuity rule reveals design. Design does not require a centralized conspiracy to function, folks. It doesn't. It only requires repeated incentives. It only requires shared dependency. It only requires mutual fragility between agencies that cannot afford to destabilize one another. Sheriff, the police, prosecutor, even probation, the courts. They can't be destabilized. They can't be seen as not one. But to call out one for its behaviors affects all of them. But it only requires that, honestly, the understanding that exposure spreads faster than resolution ever will. That's why they're mad at what I'm doing. Once that understanding settles into an institution and the people around it, delay becomes reflex rather than expectation and exception. And because delay protects careers better than decisions ever will. Delay protects budgets better than accountability ever does. And delay protects relationships between agencies better than truth ever does, folks. Delay protects power better than the law ever fucking will. That's why Montalon's unresolved trajectory matters more than and beyond Montalon. Why Nancy Smith's endurance matters beyond her own survival. And why her own daughter's carrying on of her case matters more than anything in life itself. But why McCann's insulation mattered more. It matters beyond my case, beyond Petty's entanglement, and it cannot be dismissed as isolated misfortune. Because each of these names now occupies a different corridor inside the same institutional maze, each walking a separate hallway that quietly curves back right to the center. And this is the moment that the audience, you guys, can no longer accept the narrative of isolated disputes, right? Because isolated disputes should not produce identical mechanical responses to unrelated cases. Patterns do. Patterns reveal themselves all the time, right? You see them, I see them. The story ceases to be individual and becomes systematic because the systems do not fail once in one. The systems do not fail once in the same way, right? They fail consistently. They don't malfunction randomly. They malfunction in predictable sequences. Finally got that out. And when delay, silence, jurisdictional blur, and institutional insolution appear over and over and over and over again under different names, but identical procedures, identical circumstances, the question is no longer who made the mistake. The question becomes who benefits from the delay and the mistake. And once that question is asked out loud, the story moves out of personality and into the actual structure of the law. Now, when that story moves from structure, it cannot be resolved or solved by replacing individuals alone. It has to have individuals rotate, but the machinery remains. So this is why Montalon, Smith, McCann, Petty are no longer separate chapters. They're data points. And data points, when plotted across time, do not argue. They never will. And so, at a certain point, every accountability case, it survives long enough to threaten the comfort of the institutions that are involved. The question stops being whether or not the records exist and becomes instead how the release of those records can be delayed, fragmented, diluted, routed, or neutralized without ever admitting refusal, without ever outright denial, because that creates appeal rights. And while managed obstruction simply stretches out the time of exhaustion, it does the work that censorship once had to perform directly. Right? I know, it's long. Whatever. You guys can cut this down into like 3 or 4 sections. I'm not going to do 15 different podcasts over the same bullshit. These people are assholes. It takes 3 hours to explain why they're assholes. And so this is why the critical shift that most members of the public will never see, right? Because you didn't look. Because why would you? Why would the fuck would you look? This is boring shit. I look at it and I'm like, so boring. Anyway, at this point, the critical shit, the boringness of the member of the public will never see because they'll pass the fuck out. Is because record suppression and modern institution really announces itself as destruction or refusal. It announces itself as process, review, routing, consultation, redaction, exemption, jurisdictional confusion, perpetual, pending, that appears procedural, but from the outside while functioning as enforcement on the inside, right? Because when a public entity like the government, any government agency, can control not only accountability occurs or how it occurs, but also the place and the pace at which the raw materials of accountability are released, the facts, the knowledge, the information, the messages, it effectively controls when the truth is allowed to complete and compete with power, and in systems built on mutual dependency between agencies, this is almost always forced into the slowest possible way, right? And this inversion of public records law from the transparency mechanism into a containment mechanism does not operate in theory alone because it has been applied repeatedly and methodically to deny access to records involving Chief McCann and others through claims that responsive records do not exist at all. Then through shifting bullshit explanations from Levesque and Jack Bradley and others, the records did not exist or did exist but were too voluminous to release electronically. And then through assertions of investigative extension, even when no active investigation could be confirmed, thorough redactions were so extensive that evidentiary meaning was functionally erased. Finally, through jurisdictional rerouting between the police department, the law department, and the prosecutor's office, until no single office would accept any final custodial responsibility. None of them. They won't listen to me. None of them. I get it. So what makes this method uniquely powerful is that it never really requires a single actor to explicitly say, fuck you, Aaron. No. All it really requires is the system itself becomes the answer. And that answer is always going to be motion without a rival. Process without outcome. Acknowledgement without delivery. So, if every request technically receives a response, while no request ever receives a resolution, because delay is not passive inside records, requests, or laws. Delay is leverage. Delay reshapes the public how we remember, and what journalists pursue. Delay reshapes what witnesses are willing to sustain, folks. And delay reshapes what complainants can actually emotionally, financially, and psychologically withstand. And by the time any Trench have records involving McCann, internal investigations, investigative routing, interagency coordination is finally produced, right? If it's actually produced at all, which it usually isn't, the narrative environment into which it arrives already has shifted, cooled, fractured, or been replaced. And the problem is it's been replaced by newer controversy, which means records technically arrive, but their capacity to disrupt power in real time has been neutralized structurally. And that's how public records law, which exists on paper, and the citizen's primary weapon against hidden government, becomes inverted into one of the institution's most effective shields. It doesn't need to destroy the evidence when it can simply make the evidence arrive too late to matter, right? I'm talking about shit that happened 2 years ago. And that's why record suppression almost never looks like so aggressive from the outside. But because aggression draws attention and it invites resistance, while procedural calm disarms urgency and converts outrage into patience, and patience into silence, and silence into normalization. Because every delayed response trains the responder, you, to lower your expectations. Every redaction trains the requester to accept partial reality, and every redaction or redactional reroutes. A reroute trains the requester that to chase moving targets instead of that fixed responsibility to your government. And every exemption claims that it trains the requester to internalize that some truths are simply inaccessible by design, and that over time, this training reshapes behavior, not just for one individual, but for an entire civic ecosystem. Because journalists like myself learn that the records fights are survivable, and the ones that will consume months or years of professional capital, citizens learn which questions will be acknowledged and never answered, and the institutions learn exactly how far the process can be stretched before legal friction finally appears. And this is why the repeated events and records denials involving McCann and others cannot be dismissed with me as bureaucratic or inconvenience or even clerical failure, because the same techniques appear too consistently in too many forms across too many requests to be accidental. As claims of non-existence shift into claims of investigative exemption, what really shifts into claims of privilege becomes shifts into claims of security, while the documents themselves continue to resurface indirectly through third parties, media disclosures, or litigation discovery. This is how record suppression becomes enforcement, right? Without uniforms, without the Gestapo, without papers, please, because it doesn't need to arrest your body or the body when it can exhaust your will. It doesn't need to deny the truth outright when it can just make the truth arrive without anything, and only after the moment when the truth itself could have altered the behavior in real time. And once the record suppression is normalized, and once the operational tool is rather exposed rather than exceptional abuse, the public no longer really has to be misled by this directly. They can simply be outpaced as truth becomes something that exists only in the hindsight instead of something that can intervene with decisions while they're still being made. This is where the system quietly crosses one of the most dangerous thresholds, right? In democratic governance, because the law itself remains firmly intact while its practical function is inverted. The transparency remains constitutionally guaranteed while its delivery structure is structurally neutralized. And people will argue this with me all day long. And they're right. Can I tell you, you can't really say shit to me, even though technically you're slandering me? Well, First Amendment Aaron would say no, but the guy that says you got to follow the law of the man and the law of the land says yes. Because once that inversion becomes habitual, once no single records request ever stands alone again, because every future request is now answered by precedent rather than principle, and the precedent always favors the institution, right? House always wins. That learn first how to survive and then disclosure without ever fully complying with it. That means by the time the public sees the fucking financial shape of any one case, including McCann, Petty, Montauk, Smith, Janet Masserio, insert your name here, any future name that passes through this system of machinery, the system that produced the shape has already moved on, already adapted, already recalibrated its suppression strategy to preparation for the next exposure. That's why records, expression, and suppression is not merely about what's blocked today. It's about what will be unanswerable tomorrow. So we're gonna get back a little interlude here. All right, we're gonna do this little bit on the federal threshold. Sort of explain why that this full uninterrupted long form issue is a problem, and why a local case actually becomes a federal one. So really quick, I got a couple of short pods to throw out for my advertising. DNC Radio, independent voices, local community, no filter. Follow now at facebook.com/DNC Radio OH. Hey there, folks. If you really want to know what's happening in your hometown, the place to go is Lorain Daily and Vermilion Daily. From city council and school boards to local businesses, community events, and neighborhood stories, these outlets cover what the big media ignores. This is hyper-local news for real people in real communities. Visit Lorain Daily and VermilionDaily.com today. Read it, share it, support local journalism, because your community deserves coverage that actually lives here. Hey there, folks. There we are. There's me again. Look at that. Amazing. All right, Garen, I'm going to move you out of that banner. Or maybe not. All right, well, I can't find where Garen's at, so we're going to leave this little thank you for leaving Lorraine up, because he always says that anyway. We're in our last section here. So, well, not last, but our interlude, close to the end. I know it's long, but so what? Amber, her case, her mom's case, all this shit's long. It's not going to ever be explained easily. You can sit for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 12 hours, 13 hours. But for most people, the hour of a case going into federal court sounds sort of cinematic, right? Where you hear like a switch, like somehow suddenly black SUVs arrive at the moment something feels serious enough. But in reality, federal jurisdiction really announces itself with a spectacle. It just emerges slowly and mathematically. It just shows up. Repetition, pattern, notice, all from cumulative failure to local remedies to function as law promises they should. Federal exposure does not begin with an indictment. It begins with process failure. It begins with the moment that rights still exist on paper, but no longer exist on practice. Now it begins when filings are acknowledged but never decided, when records are confirmed but they to exist but they never produced. It happened to me a lot. When investigations are referenced but never opened, when conflicts are obvious but never cured, when delay is not a pause forward or toward a decision, but a permanent condition with no visible end. And the reason this all matters legally is because the Constitution does not require proof that an official intended to violate the rights in order to trigger federal protection. Because under federal protection civil rights laws, what matters most is the and effect is not motive. And effect is measured by what actually happened or happens to a person when a system repeatedly fails to deliver process that is guaranteed in theory but withheld in reality. 1983, which I filed against four different McCann, Weitzel, Bradley, and Karen. Federal liability. It attaches when a person acted under color of law or state law, all those four people, whether by action, deliberate action, or deliberate inaction, causes the deprivation of rights secured by the Constitution and the laws of the United States. That means silence can be held just as legally allowed as denial. And when that silence follows notice and judicial trigger and repeated formal demand, that's where many people misunderstand the federal jurisdiction, right? Because they assume it requires conspiracy, malice, explicit intent, even when it in fact often arises from patterns of indifference, delay, selective response, and structural conflict that are so consistent, they become predictable. Predictability becomes the bridge between action and design. Federal equal protection doctrine is triggered not only when two cases produce different outcomes by accident, but when similarly situated people are treated differently by the same system without a legitimate government reason that can survive scrutiny. Now, what that means is the moment you have a case that's fast-tracked to another case, sidelined, or one official pursued aggressively, the other insulated indefinitely under the same enforcement authority. Sound similar? Discretion quietly mutates into discrimination. Federal due process doctrine is triggered when not only a court denies a person a hearing outright, but when a system gives the appearance of access to process without the reality of decision. Because procedural limbo is not just neutral in constitutional law, since delay without endless or endpoint denies the actually very essence of what the Constitution allows, of what due process is supposed to provide, which is timely termination by neutral authority. Federal obstruction analysis does not require someone to actually shred documents in a darkroom, because obstruction can occur just as effectively when documents are delayed or slowly delayed, fragmented, redacted into meaninglessly bullshit routed through endless custodial confusion, or shielded beyond any perpetual investigatory ambiguity until the practical ability to use them for redress quietly expires. That equates to they give you bullshit in ways you can't understand it, so you can't finally understand it. You can't articulate it to get them in trouble. And federal retaliation doctrine does not require an official to say this punishment out loud, because retaliation can be inferred through protected activities consistently followed by adverse procedural treatment, pictures, whatever, including isolation, silencing, routing, exclusion from communication, selective enforcement, or targeted delay that does not appear in cases where no challenge to power exists. All me, all Garen, all others, all Mauricio. What unites all these federal thresholds together is not emotion, not outrage, not political disagreement, but pattern plus. Notice plus effect over time. Because once a system has grown formally notified of allegations, right, like Lorraine, and has been judicially engaged through sworn filings, through me, and has placed on repeated institutional notice through record requests and status inquiries, me, Garen, Bob, anyone else, and yet it continues to delay, suppress, deflect, and avoid decision. That system is no longer operating inside discretion, right? That's Lorraine. It's operating inside foreseeability. Lorraine's justice system is now operating in foreseeability, and foreseeability is the quiet engine of federal exposure. Say what you want, but it is. Because once harm becomes predictable, exhaustion becomes predictable, financial strain becomes predictable, health impact becomes predictable, and deterrence of future challengers becomes predictable, then the institution's continued inactions become legally meaningful, even if no single memo ever confesses that. This is why federal courts do not ask whether a local system meant well. They don't give a fuck. What they ask is whether the system worked. They ask whether the process functioned properly, lawfully. They ask whether the explanation was timely. They ask whether the actual access to that product was real on either side. And they ask whether delay was this strategy or became strategy. They ask whether a decision was rendered. They ask if the case is no longer real in nature, even if every signature on paperwork is local, then why is the federal exposure not triggered by one bad day inside government? It's triggered when the same procedural failures repeat under different names, different officials in different circumstances, and different mechanical precision. So, because repetition converts anomaly into architecture, and architecture does not arise accidentally, it arises because it's functional, it survives. It protects, it absorbs pressure, it outlasts outage and outrage, it trains behavior, it conditions response, it teaches institutions how to remain legally intact while practically unaccountable. Uh, I get it. I'm telling the secrets of both sides here. Some of this can be used to protect that side. But the truth is that the meaning of the federal threshold is that not the presence of wrongdoing that moves a case beyond local containment, but it's the demonstrated inability of local systems to adjudicate its own allegations without destabilizing itself. Once that condition exists, no system no longer can actually have the ability or have the capacity to self-correct. And when self-correction becomes structurally impossible, external correction becomes legally necessary. Federal exposure is therefore not escalation. It's the substitution of a function that has failed. And what remains is discretion as consumed accountability. It's what activates when delay replaces decision. It's what intervenes when transparency exists on paper but not in delivery. It's why federal prosecutors and federal oversight never arrives as a favor to the complainant. It arrives as a corrective mechanism for the system that is demonstrated through time, repetition, and notice that it can no longer perform the simplest promise of law, which is to decide legally. So from federal threshold to federal exposure, this direct theme here is that the condition exists, the local system demonstrates the repetition, notice, and pattern that it no longer possesses the functional ability to adjudicate its own allegations without destabilizing itself, the government, or any of us. That story is no longer governed by the question of whether federal oversight is wanted, welcomed. Thanks, Karen, for keep watching. You're my one guy. I know it's you right there in that number one spot. I have to look. But at that point, federal intervention ceases to be a choice, becomes the remaining structural mechanism capable of restoring the one function that's now failed at all the local levels, right? And that's the ability to decide. We don't have it. And when that moment arrives, that story will not shift because someone demands escalation. The story shifts because escalation is already happening quietly, mathematically, predictably, through exhaustion, through delay, through repeatable suppression, through slow collapse of local process, and a permanent non-decision. And that's where we are now at. Not speculation, not threat, but in federal exposure, where at a certain point in every long-running accountability case kind of gets to this point. Systems have demonstrated that through repetition, that rather than accident, they're incapable of separating self-preservation from lawful oversight. The story necessarily didn't stop being a matter of local discretion and more becomes instead of a federal matter, right, of constitutional consequence, because the United States Constitution does not defer to county boundaries when civil rights, equal protection, and due process and lawful access to redress begin to erode under coordinated institutional delay. Federal exposure does not begin with headlines or a task force or indictments. It begins with quiet. And quietly at that moment, when the state says remedies are no longer meaningful or available in practice, even though they exist in theory, but because federal jurisdiction is not triggered through disagreement with outcomes, but the systematic failure of process itself. Let that sink in, folks. I know I'm a little liquored up. It's okay. It's how I'm actually able to have this podcast, because otherwise I wouldn't tell you this shit. This is insane. I want you to stop for 1 second and think about it. I went to my email and I found this email and I went, oh my God, this Montalon email is insane. And I read it all. And then I couldn't help but write this, because the problem is outcomes have not been systematically held by the systematic failure of the process itself, but the process is precisely the timeline that reveals that it's been repeatedly suspended through record suppression, jurisdictional routing, indefinite review, investigatory ambiguity, prosecutorial non-decision. So, once a sworn affidavit is judicially referred, no charging decision is issued. Once records requests are acknowledged, but never substantially fulfilled. Once status inquiries are answered, but silence rather than action. And once institutional conflicts are structurally embedded and never cured by independent review itself. And once delay itself becomes dominant operational theme, that response across multiple cases becomes the exception. The question ceases to be whether local institutions are choosing not to act, and becomes instead whether they are structurally incapable of acting without exposing themselves. Sounds more realistic, right? You guys have seen them out and about. I'm honest about me. Aaron drinks, but I drink at home now, so that I won't get hit with a Dram Act case. But federal law is not concerned with the local institution and what's intended to do. It's concerned with the effect the institutional conduct overall has ultimately on the process of the rights of us, the individuals. And we're subjected to its authority, its silence, and its discretion and containment, not the government. And at that point, record suppression is no longer merely a public records violation, but actually becomes potential evidence of obstruction of access to courts, because when the raw materials of accountability are delayed, fragmented, neutralized through timeline rather than denied outright, the practical ability of a citizen to seek relief, vindication, or timely redress is compromised, even though no single denial ever appears in dramatic on its own. And at that same point, prosecutorial non-decision after judicial referral is no longer merely a matter of discretion. It begins to implicate equal protection and selective enforcement doctrine, because when similarly situated cases are treated differently based on evidence and not on institutional exposure, not on evidence but institutional exposure or dependency or risk management or discretion, it quietly mutates into a discrimination between who receives process and who is left waiting for it. And on that same point, retaliatory climate and chilling effect analysis no longer lives in theory, but because those who challenged it, local power, structures, etc., that were criminal abolition and records, etc., vanished. Communication pathways, institutional silence, a response to formal filings, the message transmitted was all future challenges is not abstract but behavioral, because the system itself demonstrates what happens when those who persist federal exposure, who emerge from the moment with exhaustion, it becomes predictable, because once that time is repeatedly used as the primary enforcement tool rather than the law, the resulting fatigue, attention, isolation, they're not the problem anymore. They stop being the problem. Institutional outcomes and foreseeable issues is one of the quiet cornerstones of federal civil rights liability. It's where narrative shift from personality doctrine. Because Section 1983 liability does not require proof of a grand fucking conspiracy, right? It requires proof that people acting under color of law, be it me as a council person drawing with a red crayon saying, fuck Garen, that's wrong. Can't do that. You know, 11 can't do it. That's why these issues actually happen, folks. You guys are so mad at us. You're so fucking mad at us. I don't even care. Like, oh my god, Aaron and Garen, oh, fuck off. Honestly, you guys are like, oh, we don't want to hear this. Well, then don't listen. But we speak constitutional language. We speak intelligence. And if you're scared of intelligence, then I'm kind of scared of you. Because the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America are deliberate. And deliberate inaction is not defined by silence, right, alone. But by silence after notice. After I told you what was up. Silence after judicial trigger. After I showed you what was up. And I triggered it. Silence after repeated formal demand. I asked you. I showed you. I told you. But it's silence in the face of continuing foreseeable harm. Once that threshold is crossed, folks, local explanations begin to lose their insulting force, right? Their insulting forces, because that's what protects institution, right? Its own administrative ecosystem. Often it dissolves under federal scrutiny as routing memos become evidence, redaction powers become signals, non-responses become affirmative acts, status inquiries become notice, and political timelines become proof of fact rather than proof of calculation or caution. And that's why the federal exposure is never announced by a local system or me that created it, because the exposure is not a badge that they're going to pin on themselves, right? It's a condition that emerges once the pattern becomes legible from the outside, once repetition becomes data, once containment becomes behavior, and once delay becomes the dominant mode. At that point, the story is no longer primarily about McCann as an individual, or Hall as a sheriff, or Silo as a prosecutor, or any single official as a personality, or even Garen Petty, or Aaron Knapp, or Tia Hilton, or, Amber Brunish, the beautiful soul. Because the question no longer asks who you are, who they are, who I am. It asks the system that we all operate in demonstratively, like what it does when confronted with risks itself. It demonstratively does its slow reroute, suppress, defer, and exhaust. And rather than decide, delay, and wait till they die. Delay, deny, and wait till they die. Deny, and wait till they die. That's it. I have a new VHF, like a new Veterans of Foreign War shirt. Shows a veteran stabbed in the back by the VA with a fucking pan. That's our motto. And for those of you out there like T. Hilton, you don't get it. I don't care. I don't hate you. Tia, watch. Look, I've been drinking, so I'm kind of being honest. I don't hate you. I don't hate Garen. I don't hate anybody that ever disagree with me or agree with me. I love every last one of you fuckers. I love Tia. I love Garen. I love Aiden. I love all of you. You're humans. You're God's creations. And if I'm to believe in God, and I believe in my Bible, and I tell people to believe in what's right, not what's wrong, to do the right thing, I can't be mad at any of you. From John Burrow to Aiden Fogel to T. Hilton to any of you yaks on Facebook whose names I can't remember. Because I've argued with so many of you, so many times. But once, we're going back into our story now, because I had a moment. Once that moment arrives, the system no longer controls the pace of the truth the way that it wants to. Because federal timelines do not bend the way the county calendars do. The federal litigation does not route through local gatekeepers. It doesn't have a federal discovery, does not pause for Lorraine to say, oh, institutional comfort. That's why the story does not end at the county line, right? It's, once a system demonstrates that it can survive indefinitely without deciding, Lorraine, the only authority capable of forcing the decision is the one that does not share its dependencies. Aaron, Lorraine County. So, but they can't do it, so go above that. Ottawa, wherever. The record you leave behind, and the final call to action here becomes this. At the end of every long investigation, after the filings have been submitted and the records have been routed and the affidavits have been sworn and the denials have been issued, reviews have been extended, the silence has been preserved, and the waiting has been normalized, right? The final question always becomes the same thing. What remains no longer what the system chose to do, but what the record it it chose to leave behind of itself was doing. Because institutions do not produce just outcomes, they produce trails. They produce timelines. I've proven that. They produce patterns of response. Because they're historical fingerprint long after any individual official has ever rotated out of office, retired, transferred, disappeared into public life or private life. Because people move on, but records don't. Delays itself become a document, even when no member ever written was able to justify it. And what the record reflects is that once it's viewed in full and without protective sort of filters of routing, redaction, and discretionary silence, it's simply a disagreement over enforcement priorities, but it's a clash of legal interpretations, a sustained demonstration of power, behaves when it's exposed to anything that becomes part of a case. Because what emerges is not chaos, not accident, not remarkably consistent preference for delay. Are you hearing me? Uh, oh, well, you're hearing me. So, the bottom line is, it no longer belongs to any of these people. This is where the record truly becomes the verdict in the absence of one, because when the courts don't decide that prosecutors do charge, and when they do decide what records do not arrive, and investigators do not return calls, and timelines dissolve into silence with Silo, that's the only remaining evidence that becomes the system, right? That's the problem, is that the behavior is now preserved. It's preserved in chilling dates beyond anything. It's preserved in unanswered correspondence. It's preserved in judicial referrals without visible outcomes. It's preserved in records requests that were acknowledged but never fulfilled in a meaningful form. It's preserved in conflict, right? Claims that redact or redirected oversight without curing a conflict. It's preserved in the calm language of review that quietly replaced the obligation to actually like decide. The preservation is the record that leaves you behind. The record will outlast everything in every press conference. It will outlast every campaign slogan. It will outlast every retirement, every announcement. It will outlast every explanation offered along the way after the moment of explanation has passed. Because the records don't forget. The only way for someone is to read them in sequence. The and that's where the story stands, right? Not about a demand for vengeance, not as a demand for spectacle, not as a demand for political advantage, not as a demand for fusion or simplest promise of the law, because it's not that will always be comfortable. It's just that it'll be decided, acted upon, resolved upon, that it will not suspend people indefinitely inside unresolved accusations of the system while it remains protected by time. So, if I'm looking at from a final call to action, does it belong to one office, one agency, one official alone? Because the responsibility sort of for correction rests with everyone who has authority to interrupt, delay, decision, silence, statement, routing, resolution, and containment within accountability. Anyway, if you're an elected official, and this is where you decide, right? If you're watching, you're not right now, but you may be later, whether your name becomes associated with restoration or preservation. If you're a prosecutor, Solo, Riley, Mallory, this is where you get to decide whether discretion remains a shield, becomes that brick wall to public trust. If you're a judge, this is where you decide whether referral is the end of your authority or the beginning of your demand for compliance. If you're a records custodian, Brianna, this is where you decide whether your transparency remains a promise or becomes a deliberate act. I always promise. Now, if you're a citizen, this is where you decide telling becomes the new normal for whether waiting is finally interpreted by insolence or insistence. That becomes the most dangerous thing. The institution can teach to the public is not that power is corrupt. The most dangerous thing they can teach us is that power is immovable. The history does show that time and time again, power only remains immovable when it's required to move. Not a threat, not rhetoric. It's the mechanical truth of accountability. Now, the call to action is simple in language, even if it's difficult in execution, because there's only one remaining demand that satisfies the record as it now stands, besides truth. Decide, folks. Decide whether the case will be investigated. I know we're probably being like blown down by storms, but decide whether it'll be declined or declinated. Decide whether it'll be referred. Decide whether an independent authority like the Ottawa County Prosecutor will be appointed by the AG, not you, Tony. So decide whether the records will be released in full. Decide whether institutional conflict will be cured. And decide whether the silence will finally be replaced by an answer. Decide, because that delay is no longer neutral. That delay is an allegation. It's a record of delay is complete. So we're on our final closing here, folks. We're gonna close up. I got no viewers, but that's okay because you guys will see later. We're on that last section. And the last section, I want to say this: there is no other choice whatsoever. The final closing will say no other choice than what the system itself has done to itself. I have seen it make me sick by writing this shit. I know what it is. So at this point, even in the story, like, my feelings are this. Everything you just heard and all this other long-winded bullshit that I wish I didn't have to say, I want to be unmistakably clear. This is our ending. Something people will inevitably ask. I always kept it going. I always kept filing. I always kept requesting. I don't simply walk away once it becomes obvious how heavy the resistance was or is. The answer is not that I wanted conflict, right? Not that I enjoy confrontation. Not that I am driven by a spectacle. And I eventually reach a point where there's no legitimate exit left that requires me to surrender to the meaning of law itself. Because walking away is only a choice. When the system gives you a lawful path forward, and that's what you have listened to all your life, is the systematic removal of every lawful path until silence remained. And silence was being used not as neutrality, but as control, not as caution, but as restraint, and not as a review, but as a method of wearing a person down without ever having to prove anything in the open. I didn't choose this escalation first. I didn't choose compliance or documentation. Well, actually, what I did choose was this. I did choose compliance. So I like the rules. I chose compliance, documentation. I chose statute, the law, sworn filings. I did those. Judicial referral when I was sent back to me. Records requests when I got them. Patience. Time. I chose each of these things because repeatedly, even when none of them produced movement, ever, I said, do one and you did three. Okay, fine. That that's when you're supposed to be able to enter it without being punished, without simply insisting that you function as written. And when people now say that I'm the problem, right? They look at me that way. They're really saying is that the system should be allowed to remain unchallenged, and that it decides not to decide because a system that punishes people for persistence is a system that only works for those who already hold power inside it. This has not become unavoidable because I am stubborn. It becomes unavoidable because every mechanism that should have resolved this bullshit cause inside the ordinary flow of government was stalled, rerouted, absorbed, or neutralized without explanation. And when the lawful off ramps became quietly removed, what remains is not escalation by choice, but escalation by necessity. I did not create this conflict by demanding special treatment. I created it by asking for ordinary treatment, right? By asking for investigation or declination. Someone asked me, what's declination mean? And they declined to do anything about it because they're bitches. Like, by asking for records or denial, by asking for records or responses or refusal, by asking yes or no, right? I don't care. I really don't. For once, I don't care if you're beautiful. I'd like it if you were, because I'm a man. But one time, in all of everything I've ever received from all the things, the last one you guys gave me, I don't know who it was. Whatever that girl was, she's beautiful. Everybody else, nothing. But I digress. When people say this could have gone differently, I kind of had a quieter, more patient, more agreeable, more willing way to accept half those answers and endless delays. But what they're really saying is that the system rewards silence and punishes inconsistency or insistence, in my case. Yes, 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 yes. So I can accept that as operating rule of law. Because when the price of peace is surrendering the idea that process must actually function, then that peace is not peace at all. It's quiet compliance and forced to exhaustion. I look grossly enough, sexually enough. I'll stare at your boobs all day long, but I'm not going to give up freedom of speech. I will have the freedom of speech to say that left one looks bigger than the right one. I still love them both. But that peace is not peace at all, right? It's just quiet compliance and forced to exhaustion. We're tired of arguing with everybody of everything. I didn't write here because I want to argue with you or I want to make enemies. I love all of Lorraine. Every last one. I don't give a fuck. I even like the little weird ass Pruitt guy and and all the people that hate me. I don't dislike any of you. None of you. Why would I hate you, Pruitt? Honestly, what do I know about you? I'm gonna seriously. To me, you do, Pruitt. You know what I'm talking about. I'm not gonna say your bullshit full name out loud. What would I have to be mad at you about? Nothing. Not a goddamn thing. I don't have nothing to be mad at you about because you're just you. Any of your anyone, no affiliates. I'm not mad at anybody, but the idea becomes this, all right? And it really boils down to, are you asking for records or denial? Are you asking for response or refusal? Are you asking for yes or no instead of permanent suspicion? Because what I received over and over again was neither yes or no, but an institutional refusal to decide at all. Not a personal dispute, folks. Ow. That's structural failure. So people say, this could have gone a little bit differently. If Aaron, if you just been a little quieter, maybe more patient, more agreeable, more willing to accept the half answers and display. And what they're really saying is, system rewards matter, silence punches, and consistency are insistence. And that Aaron's not willing to accept that operating the rule of law is surrendering peace. The idea that process must actually function, that peace, not process, it's actual compliance with enforced exhaustion. I did not arrive because I wanted this. This system made this decision impossible without pressure. And that's the part that often gets lost in stories like this. Because the institution always gets to say who is following procedure, while the person outside that institution gets reduced to a tone, personality, or persistence. As if that persistence were misconduct. But persistence is what remains when justice goes silent. And if that makes me inconvenient, then inconvenience is simply a sound that accountability will make when it knocks on a door that was never meant to be opened. I didn't need this fight. I didn't. I didn't this role. I didn't need this. I don't gain anything by being here. I honestly, I like the first girl out of all the girls that messaged me when I said messaged me was a girl that was messaging about rats. She killed my rats. But all I can say is this. This alone, I didn't need this fight. And I don't. I need the fight against you or your rats with the rat bat. I don't take this role. I don't gain anything by being here. All I did was refuse to disappear quietly when the system itself refused or decided that waiting forever was not an acceptable substitute really for deciding at all. Like the problem isn't that I kept going. The problem is that they kept it unresolved. Problem is not that I'm filed. The problem is they stalled. The problem is not that I documented, they deflected. It's not that I escalated, because that escalation became the only remaining lawful movement they had left. And now, I'd like to end this with strategy and law and human behavior all intersect finally, because long before any of these institutions ever existed, I read books on Sun Tzu that wrote that every battle is won before it's fought. Because the true battlefield is not the field on itself, right? It's the structure of the decision, the trend of the incident. And so the problem is that mistakes, the mistakes that a force makes when it's believed delay is safer than clarity. Well, and I do what I do as game theory is known as a dominant strategy that only works as long as the opposing player, the government, chooses never to be forced into a resolution. Because indefinite delay only benefits the side that controls time, right? So resources and procedure. And until that moment arrives when the other players refuse to continue to participate in a game where rules are often used to prevent outcomes rather than produce them. When we look at Occam's razor, And that tells us that even simpler and more brutal ways of which really is that the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions is almost always the correct one, and the simplest explanation for why they remain unresolved go for so long. Not complexity, not confusion, not accident, not coincidence, but the delay itself is the interest of power and the better than decision would ever be. So, from a strategic standpoint, right, this was not chaos, it was not choice. From a game theory standpoint, or game theoretical standpoint, this was not disorder, it was incentive. It was from the standpoint of Occam's razor, it didn't require conspiracy to explain or why silence was preserved. Only the recognition that silence protected the system better than the truth ever could be used while remaining unresolved. So this is why I truly had no other choice but to feel this way. Because you see it more clearly, and once you understand which side benefits whichever siding, once you recognize the delay was because the strategy and the silence had become the shield, and only remaining lawful move was that the board is to force the game into a state where decision must finally occur. That's not recklessness, folks. That's obsession. Or it's not even obsession, actually. It's not even personal vendetta. It's the inevitability of strategy when the law, time, and power finally intersect. I didn't force the confrontation. The system forced it by refusing to choose. And now, choice has finally returned where it belonged with those who have served the authority to decide, right? That's it. And that's where tonight I think I feel like I'll leave you. These people in authority have supported you all your life. So either I'm wrong or they're wrong. Your truth tellers are wrong. So you're saying Amber's wrong? You're saying Nancy, your mom's wrong? All these truth tellers told me different truths. The only truth I heard at the end of everything was the one truth no one wanted me to tell at the end of every one. So I got through all my little sets just now. The last of every one was the worst of every one. And eventually I will do that. But right now I'm going to say this. Amber Smith did not deserve what happened to her mom. Nancy Smith did not deserve what happened to her. Joseph Allen, same thing. None of you deserve any of that. I'll stand up for you until the end of time. That being said, thank you for tuning in tonight. I appreciate you, and we'll see you guys next week. I'm sorry, tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in. We're going to talk tomorrow a little bit more about all these things that we've been talking about. But tonight, we are done, folks.